Chapter 11. The Corsican ogre. At the sight of this agitation, Louis XVIII pushed from him violently the table at which he was sitting. "What ails you, Baron?" he exclaimed. "You appear quite aghast. Has your uneasiness anything to do with what M. de Blocas has told me, and M. de Villefort has just confirmed?" M. de Blocas moved suddenly towards the Baron, but the fright of the courtier pleaded for the forbearance of the statesman, and besides, as matters were, it was much more to his advantage that the prefect of police should triumph over him than that he should humiliate the prefect. "Sire," stammered the Baron. "Well, what is it?" asked Louis XVIII. The minister of police, giving way to an impulse of despair, was about to throw himself at the feet of Louis XVIII, who retreated a step and frowned. "Will you speak?" he said. "Oh, sire, what a dreadful misfortune! I am indeed to be pitied. I can never forgive myself." "Monsieur," said Louis XVIII, "I command you to speak." "Well, sire, the usurper left Elba on the February 26th, and landed on the 1st of March. "And where? In Italy?" asked the king eagerly. "In France, sire, at a small port near Antibes in the Gulf of Juan." The usurper landed in France near Antibes in the Gulf of Juan, 250 leagues from Paris, on the 1st of March, and you only acquired this information today, the 3rd of March. "Well, sir, what you tell me is impossible. You must have received a false report, or you have gone mad." "Alas, sire, it is but too true." Louis made a gesture of indescribable anger and alarm, and then drew himself up as if this sudden blow had struck him at the same moment in heart and countenance. "In France!" he cried. "The usurper in France! Then they did not watch over this man. Who knows? They were, perhaps, in league with him." "Oh, sire!" exclaimed the Duc de Blocas. "M. d'André is not a man to be accused of treason. Sire, we have all been blind, and the minister of police has shared the general blindness, that is all." "But," said Villefort, and then suddenly checking himself, he was silent. Then he continued, "Your pardon, sire," he said, bowing. "My zeal carried me away. Will your majesty deign to excuse me?" "Speak, sir, speak boldly," replied Louis. "You alone forewarned us of the evil. Now try and aid us with the remedy." "Sire," said Villefort, "the usurper is detested in the south, and it seems to me that if he ventured into the south, it would be easy to raise Languedoc and Provence against him." "Yes, assuredly," replied the minister. "But he is advancing by Gap and Sisteron." "Advancing, he is advancing," said Louis XVIII. "Is he then advancing on Paris?" The minister of police maintained a silence which was equivalent to a complete avowal. "And Dauphiné, sir?" inquired the king of Villefort. "Do you think it possible to rouse that as well as Provence?" "Sire, I am sorry to tell your majesty a cruel fact, but the feeling in Dauphiné is quite the reverse of that in Provence or Languedoc. The mountaineers are Bonapartists." "Sire." "Then," murmured Louis, he was well informed. "And how many men had he with him?" "I do not know, sire," answered the minister of police. "What, you do not know? Have you neglected to obtain information on that point? Of course it is of no consequence," he added with a withering smile. "Sire, it was impossible to learn. The dispatch simply stated the fact of the landing and the route taken by the usurper." "And how did this dispatch reach you?" inquired the king. The minister bowed his head, and while a deep color overspread his cheeks, he stammered out, "By the telegraph, sire." Louis XVIII advanced a step and folded his arms over his chest as Napoleon would have done. 141 "So then," he exclaimed, turning pale with anger, 7 conjoined and allied armies overthrew that man. A miracle of heaven replaced me on the throne of my fathers after 25 years of exile. I have, during those 25 years, spared no pains to understand the people of France and the interests which were confided to me. And now, when I see the fruition of my wishes almost within reach, the power I hold in my hands bursts and shatters me to atoms." "Sire, it is fatality," murmured the minister, feeling that the pressure of circumstances, however light a thing to destiny, was too much for any human strength to endure. "What our enemies say of us is then true. We have learnt nothing, forgotten nothing. If I were betrayed as he was, I would console myself. But to be in the midst of persons elevated by myself to places of honor, who ought to watch over me more carefully than over themselves. For my fortune is theirs, before me they were nothing, after me they will be nothing, and perish miserably from incapacity, ineptitude. Oh, yes, sir, you are right. It is fatality. The minister quailed before this outburst of sarcasm. M. de Blocas wiped the moisture from his brow. Villefort smiled within himself, for he felt his increased importance. To fall, continued King Louis, who at the first glance had sounded the abyss on which the monarchy hung suspended. To fall, and learn of that fall by telegraph. Oh, I would rather mount the scaffold of my brother, Louis XVI, than thus descend the staircase at the Tuileries driven away by ridicule. Ridicule, sir, why, you know not its power in France, and yet you ought to know it. Sire, sire, murmured the minister, for pities? Approach, M. de Villefort, resumed the king, addressing the young man, who, motionless and breathless, was listening to a conversation on which depended the destiny of a kingdom. Approach, and tell monsieur that it is possible to know beforehand all that he has not known. Sire, it was really impossible to learn secrets which that man concealed from all the world. Really impossible. Yes, that is a great word, sir. Unfortunately, there are great words as there are great men. I have measured them. Really impossible for a minister who has an office, agents, spies, and 1,500,000 francs for secret service money, to know what is going on at 60 leagues from the coast of France. Well, then, see, here is a gentleman who had none of these resources at his disposal. A gentleman, only a simple magistrate, who learned more than you with all your police, and who would have saved my crown if, like you, he had the power of directing a telegraph. The look of the minister of police was turned with concentrated spite on Villefort, who bent his head in modest triumph. I do not mean that for you, Blocas, continued Louis XVIII. For if you have discovered nothing, at least you have had the good sense to persevere in your suspicions. Any other than yourself would have considered the disclosure of M. de Villefort insignificant, or else dictated by venal ambition. These words were an allusion to the sentiments which the minister of police had uttered with so much confidence an hour before. Villefort understood the king's intent. Any other person would, perhaps, have been overcome by such an intoxicating draught of praise, but he feared to make for himself a mortal enemy of the police minister, although he saw that D'André was irrevocably lost. In fact, the minister, who, in the plenitude of his power, had been unable to unearth Napoleon's secret, might in despair at his own downfall interrogate Dantès and so lay bare the motives of Villefort's plot. Realizing this, Villefort came to the rescue of the crestfallen minister instead of aiding to crush him. Sire, said Villefort, the suddenness of this event must prove to your majesty that the issue is in the hands of Providence. What your majesty is pleased to attribute to me as profound perspicacity is simply owing to chance, and I have profited by that chance, like a good and devoted servant, that's all. Do not attribute to me more than I deserve, sire, that your majesty may never have occasion to recall the first opinion you have been pleased to form of me. The minister of police thanked the young man by an eloquent look, and Villefort understood that he had succeeded in his design. That is to say, that without forfeiting the gratitude of the king, he had made a friend of one on whom, in case of necessity, he might rely. "'Tis well," resumed the king. "And now, gentlemen," he continued, turning towards M. de Blocas and the minister of police, "I have no further occasion for you, and you may retire. What now remains to do is in the department of the minister of war." "Fortunately, sire," said M. de Blocas, "we can rely on the army. Your majesty knows how every report confirms their loyalty and attachment. Do not mention reports, Duke, to me, for I know now what confidence to place in them. Yet, speaking of reports, Baron, what have you learned with regard to the affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "The affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques!" exclaimed Villefort, unable to repress an exclamation. Then, suddenly pausing, he added, "Your pardon, sire, but my devotion to your majesty has made me forget, not the respect I have, for that is too deeply engraved in my heart, but the rules of etiquette." Go on, sir," replied the king. "You have today earned the right to make inquiries here." "Sire," interposed the minister of police, "I came a moment ago to give your majesty fresh information which I had obtained on this head. when your Majesty's attention was attracted by the terrible event that has occurred in the Gulf, and now these facts will cease to interest your Majesty. On the contrary, sir, on the contrary, said Louis XVIII. This affair seems to me to have a decided connection with that which occupies our attention, and the death of General Canel will, perhaps, put us on the direct track of a great internal conspiracy. At the name of General Canel, Villefort trembled. Everything points to the conclusion, sire, said the Minister of Police. That death was not the result of suicide, as we first believed, but of assassination. General Canel, it appears, had just left a Bonapartist club when he disappeared. An unknown person had been with him that morning, and made an appointment with him in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Unfortunately, the general's valet, who was dressing his hair at the moment when the stranger entered, heard the street mentioned, but did not catch the number. As the police minister related this to the king, Villefort, who looked as if his very life hung on the speaker's lips, turned alternately red and pale. The king looked towards him. Do you not think with me, M. de Villefort, that General Canel, whom they believed attached to the usurper, but who was really entirely devoted to me, has perished the victim of a Bonapartist ambush? It is probable, sire, replied Villefort. But is this all that is known? They are on the track of the man who appointed the meeting with him. On his track? Said Villefort. Yes, the servant has given his description. He is a man of from 50 to 52 years of age, dark, with black eyes covered with shaggy eyebrows, and a thick mustache. He was dressed in a blue frock coat, buttoned up to the chin, and wore at his buttonhole the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor. Yesterday a person exactly corresponding with this description was followed, but he was lost sight of at the corner of the Rue de la Jussienne and the Rue Coq-Heron. Villefort leaned on the back of an armchair, for as the Minister of Police went on speaking he felt his legs bend under him. But when he learned that the unknown had escaped the vigilance of the agent who followed him, he breathed again. Continue to seek for this man, sir, said the king to the Minister of Police. For if, as I am all but convinced, General Canel, who would have been so useful to us at this moment, has been murdered, his assassins, Bonapartists or not, shall be cruelly punished. It required all Villefort's coolness not to betray the terror with which this declaration of the king inspired him. How strange, continued the king with some asperity. The police think that they have disposed of the whole matter when they say, a murder has been committed, and especially so when they can add, and we are on the track of the guilty persons. Sire, your Majesty will, I trust, be amply satisfied on this point at least. We shall see. I will no longer detain you, M. de Villefort, for you must be fatigued after so long a journey. Go and rest. Of course you stopped at your father's. A feeling of faintness came over Villefort. 0145 M. No, sire, he replied. I alighted at the Hotel de Madrid, in the Rue de Tournon. But you have seen him? Sire, I went straight to the Duc de Blacas. But you will see him, then? I think not, sire. Ah, I forgot, said Louis, smiling in a manner which proved that all these questions were not made without a motive. I forgot you and M. Noirtier are not on the best terms possible, and that is another sacrifice made to the royal cause, and for which you should be recompensed. Sire, the kindness your Majesty deigns to evince towards me is a recompense which so far surpasses my utmost ambition that I have nothing more to ask for. Never mind, sir, we will not forget you. Make your mind easy. In the meanwhile, the king here detached the cross of the Legion of Honor which he usually wore over his blue coat, near the cross of St. Louis, above the order of Notre Dame du Mont Carmel and St. Lazare, and gave it to Villefort. In the meanwhile take this cross. Sire, said Villefort, your Majesty mistakes. This is an officer's cross. Ma foi, said Louis XVIII. Take it, such as it is, for I have not the time to procure you another. Blacas, let it be your care to see that the brevet is made out and sent to M. de Villefort. Villefort's eyes were filled with tears of joy and pride. He took the cross and kissed it. And now, he said, may I inquire what are the orders with which your Majesty deigns to honor me? Take what rest you require, and remember that if you are not able to serve me here in Paris, you may be of the greatest service to me at Marseilles. Sire, replied Villefort, bowing, in an hour I shall have quitted Paris. Go, sir, said the king. And should I forget you, king's memories are short. Do not be afraid to bring yourself to my recollection. Baron, send for the minister of war. Blockas, remain. Ah, sir, said the minister of police to Villefort as they left the Tuileries. You entered by luck's door, your fortune is made. Will it be long first? Muttered Villefort, saluting the minister, whose career was ended, and looking about him for a hackney coach. One passed at the moment which he hailed. He gave his address to the driver and, springing in, threw himself on the seat, and gave loose to dreams of ambition. 10 minutes afterwards Villefort reached his hotel, ordered horses to be ready in 2 hours, and asked to have his breakfast brought to him. He was about to begin his repast when the sound of the bell rang sharp and loud. The valet opened the door, and Villefort heard someone speak his name. 0147M. Who could know that I was here already? Said the young man. The valet entered. Well, said Villefort, what is it? Who rang? Who asked for me? A stranger who will not send in his name. A stranger who will not send in his name. What can he want with me? He wishes to speak to you. To me? Yes. Did he mention my name? Yes. What sort of person is he? Why, sir, a man of about 50. Short or tall? About your own height, sir. Dark or fair? Dark. Very dark. With black eyes, black hair, black eyebrows. And how dressed? Asked Villefort quickly. In a blue frock coat, buttoned up close, decorated with the Legion of Honor. It is he, said Villefort, turning pale. Pardieu, said the individual whose description we have twice given, entering the door. What a great deal of ceremony! Is it the custom in Marseilles for sons to keep their fathers waiting in their anterooms? Father, cried Villefort. Then I was not deceived. I felt sure it must be you. Well, then, if you felt so sure, replied the newcomer, putting his cane in a corner and his hat on a chair. Allow me to say, my dear Gerard, that it was not very filial of you to keep me waiting at the door. Leave us, Germain, said Villefort. The servant quitted the apartment with evident signs of astonishment. Chapter 12. Father and son M. Noirtier, for it was indeed he who entered, looked after the servant until the door was closed, and then, fearing, no doubt, that he might be overheard in the antechamber, he opened the door again, nor was the precaution useless, as appeared from the rapid retreat of Germain, who proved that he was not exempt from the sin which ruined our first parents. M. Noirtier then took the trouble to close and bolt the antechamber door, then that of the bedchamber, and then extended his hand to Villefort, who had followed all his motions with surprise which he could not conceal. Well now, my dear Gerard, said he to the young man, with a very significant look, do you know, you seem as if you were not very glad to see me? My dear father, said Villefort, I am, on the contrary, delighted, but I so little expected your visit that it has somewhat overcome me. But, my dear fellow, replied M. Noirtier, seating himself, I might say the same thing to you, when you announced to me your wedding for the 28th of February, and on the 3rd of March you turn up here in Paris. And if I have come, my dear father, said Gerard, drawing closer to M. Noirtier, do not complain, for it is for you that I came, and my journey will be your salvation. Ah, indeed, said M. Noirtier, stretching himself out at his ease in the chair. Really, pray tell me all about it, for it must be interesting. Father, you have heard speak of a certain Bonapartist club in the Rue Saint-Jacques? Number 53. Yes, I am vice-president. Father, your coolness makes me shudder. Why, my dear boy, when a man has been proscribed by the mountaineers, has escaped from Paris in a haycart, been hunted over the plains of Bordeaux by Robespierre's bloodhounds, he becomes accustomed to most things. But go on, what about the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques? Why, they induced General Canel to go there, and General Canel, who quitted his own house at 9 o'clock in the evening, was found the next day in the Seine. 0151M, and who told you this fine story? The king himself. Well, then, in return for your story, continued Noirtier, I will tell you another. My dear father, I think I already know what you are about to tell me. Ah, you have heard of the landing of the emperor? Not so loud, father, I entreat of you, for your own sake as well as mine. Yes, I heard this news and knew it even before you could. For 3 days ago I posted from Marseilles to Paris with all possible speed, half desperate at the enforced delay. 3 days ago? You are crazy. Why, 3 days ago the Emperor had not landed. No matter, I was aware of his intention. How did you know about it? By a letter addressed to you from the island of Elba. To me, to you, and which I discovered in the pocketbook of the messenger. Had that letter fallen into the hands of another, you, my dear father, would probably ere this have been shot. Villefort's father laughed. Come, come, said he. Will the Restoration adopt imperial methods so promptly? Shot, my dear boy? What an idea! Where is the letter you speak of? I know you too well to suppose you would allow such a thing to pass you. I burnt it, for fear that even a fragment should remain, for that letter must have led to your condemnation. And the destruction of your future prospects, replied Noirtier. Yes, I can easily comprehend that, but I have nothing to fear while I have you to protect me. I do better than that, sir. I save you. You do? Why, really, the thing becomes more and more dramatic. Explain yourself. I must refer again to the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques. It appears that this club is rather a bore to the police. Why didn't they search more vigilantly? They would have found. They have not found, but they are on the track. Yes, that the usual phrase. I am quite familiar with it. When the police is at fault, it declares that it is on the track, and the government patiently awaits the day when it comes to say, with a sneaking air, that the track is lost. Yes, but they have found a corpse. The general has been killed, and in all countries they call that a murder. A murder, do you call it? Why, there is nothing to prove that the general was murdered. People are found every day in the Seine, having thrown themselves in, or having been drowned from not knowing how to swim. Father, you know very well that the general was not a man to drown himself in despair, and people do not bathe in the Seine in the month of January. No, no, do not be deceived. This was murder in every sense of the word. And who thus designated it? The king himself. The king. I thought he was philosopher enough to allow that there was no murder in politics. In politics, my dear fellow, as well as I do, there are no men but ideas, no feelings but interests. In politics we do not kill a man, we only remove an obstacle, that is all. Would you like to know how matters have progressed? Well, I will tell you. It was thought reliance might be placed in General Canel. He was recommended to us from the island of Elba. One of us went to him and invited him to the Rue Saint-Jacques, where he would find some friends. He came there, and the plan was unfolded to him for leaving Elba, the projected landing, etc. When he had heard and comprehended all to the fullest extent, he replied that he was a royalist. Then all looked at each other. He was made to take an oath and did so, but with such an ill grace that it was really tempting Providence to swear thus. And yet, in spite of that, the general was allowed to depart free, perfectly free. Yet he did not return home. What could that mean? Why, my dear fellow, that on leaving us he lost his way, that's all. A murder? Really, Villefort, you surprise me. You, a deputy procureur, to found an accusation on such bad premises. Did I ever say to you, when you were fulfilling your character as a royalist, and cut off the head of one of my party, my son, you have committed a murder? No, I said. Very well, sir, you have gained the victory. Tomorrow, perchance, it will be our turn. But, father, take care. When our turn comes, our revenge will be sweeping. I do not understand you. You rely on the usurper's return? We do. You are mistaken. He will not advance 2 leagues into the interior of France without being followed, tracked, and caught like a wild beast. My dear fellow, the emperor is at this moment on the way to Grenoble. On the 10th or 12th he will be at Lyons, and on the 20th or 25th at Paris. The people will rise. Yes, to go and meet him. He has but a handful of men with him, and armies will be dispatched against him. Yes, to escort him into the capital. Really, my dear Gerard, you are but a child. You think yourself well informed because the telegraph has told you, 3 days after the landing. The usurper has landed at Cannes with several men. He is pursued. But where is he? What is he doing? You do not know at all. and in this way they will chase him to Paris without drawing a trigger. Grenoble and Lyons are faithful cities, and will oppose to him an impassable barrier. Grenoble will open her gates to him with enthusiasm. All Lyons will hasten to welcome him. Believe me, we are as well informed as you, and our police are as good as your own. Would you like a proof of it? Well, you wished to conceal your journey from me, and yet I knew of your arrival half an hour after you had passed the barrier. You gave your direction to no one but your postilion, yet I have your address, and in proof I am here the very instant you are going to sit at table. Ring, then, if you please, for a second knife, fork and plate, and we will dine together. Indeed, replied Villefort, looking at his father with astonishment. You really do seem very well informed. The thing is simple enough. You who are in power have only the means that money produces. We who are in expectation have those which devotion prompts. Devotion, said Villefort with a sneer. Yes, devotion. For that is, I believe, the phrase for hopeful ambition. And Villefort's father extended his hand to the bell rope, to summon the servant whom his son had not called. Villefort caught his arm. Wait, my dear father, said the young man. One word more. Say on. However stupid the royalist police may be, they do no one terrible thing. What is that? The description of the man who, on the morning of the day when General Canel disappeared, presented himself at his house. Oh, the admirable police have found that out, have they? And what may be that description? Dark complexion, hair, eyebrows and whiskers black, blue frock coat, buttoned up to the chin, rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor in his buttonhole, a hat with wide brim and a cane. Ah, ha, that's it, is it? Said Noirtier. And why, then, have they not laid hands on him? Illustration, the changed clothes. Because yesterday or the day before, they lost sight of him at the corner of the Rue Coq-Héron. Didn't I say that your police were good for nothing? Yes, but they may catch him yet. True, said Noirtier, looking carelessly around him. True, if this person were not on his guard as he is. And he added with a smile, he will consequently make a few changes in his personal appearance. At these words he rose and put off his frock coat and cravat, went towards a table on which lay his son's toilet articles, lathered his face, took a razor and, with a firm hand, cut off the compromising whiskers. Villefort watched him with alarm not devoid of admiration. His whiskers cut off, Noirtier gave another turn to his hair, took, instead of his black cravat, a colored neckerchief which lay at the top of an open portmanteau, put on, in lieu of his blue and high-buttoned frock coat, a coat of Villefort's of dark brown, and cut away in front, tried on before the glass a narrow-brimmed hat of his son's, which appeared to fit him perfectly, and, leaving his cane in the corner where he had deposited it, he took up a small bamboo switch, cut the air with it once or twice, and walked about with that easy swagger which was one of his principal characteristics. Well, he said, turning towards his wondering son, when this disguise was completed, well, do you think your police will recognize me now? No, father, stammered Villefort. At least, I hope not. And now, my dear boy, continued Noirtier, I rely on your prudence to remove all the things which I leave in your care. Oh, rely on me, said Villefort. Yes, yes, and now I believe you are right, and that you have really saved my life. Be assured I will return the favor hereafter. Villefort shook his head. You are not convinced yet? I hope at least that you may be mistaken. Shall you see the king again? Perhaps. Would you pass in his eyes for a prophet? Prophets of evil are not in favor at the court, father. True, but some day they do them justice, and supposing a second restoration, you would then pass for a great man. Well, what should I say to the king? Say this to him, Sire, you are deceived as to the feeling in France, as to the opinions of the towns, and the prejudices of the army. He whom in Paris you call the Corsican ogre, who at Nevers is styled the usurper, is already saluted as Bonaparte at Lyons and Emperor at Grenoble. You think he is tracked, pursued, captured. He is advancing as rapidly as his own eagles. The soldiers you believe to be dying with hunger, worn out with fatigue, ready to desert, gather like atoms of snow about the rolling ball as it hastens onward. Sire, go, leave France to its real master, To him who acquired it, not by purchase, but by right of conquest. Go, sire, not that you incur any risk, for your adversary is powerful enough to show you mercy, but because it would be humiliating for a grandson of St. Louis to owe his life to the man of Arcola, Marengo, Austerlitz. Tell him this, Gerard, or, rather, tell him nothing. Keep your journey a secret. Do not boast of what you have come to Paris to do or have done. Return with all speed. Enter Marseilles at night and your house by the back door, and there remain quiet, submissive, secret, and, above all, inoffensive. For this time, I swear to you, we shall act like powerful men who know their enemies. Go, my son, go, my dear Gerard, and by your obedience to my paternal orders, or, if you prefer it, friendly counsels, we will keep you in your place. This will be, added Noirtier with a smile, one means by which you may a second time save me, if the political balance should some day take another turn, and cast you aloft while hurling me down. Adieu, my dear Gerard, and at your next journey alight at my door. Noirtier left the room when he had finished, with the same calmness that had characterized him during the whole of this remarkable and trying conversation. Villefort, pale and agitated, ran to the window, put aside the curtain, and saw him pass, cool and collected, by 2 or 3 ill-looking men at the corner of the street, who were there, perhaps, to arrest a man with black whiskers and a blue frock-coat and hat with broad brim. Villefort stood watching, breathless, until his father had disappeared at the Rue Bussy. Then he turned to the various articles he had left behind him, put the black cravat and blue frock-coat at the bottom of the portmanteau, threw the hat into a dark closet, broke the cane into small bits and flung it in the fire, put on his traveling cap and, calling his valet, checked with a look the 1,000 questions he was ready to ask, paid his bill, sprang into his carriage, which was ready, learned at Lyons that Bonaparte had entered Grenoble, and in the midst of the tumult which prevailed along the road, at length reached Marseilles, a prey to all the hopes and fears which enter into the heart of man with ambition and its first successes. Chapter 13. The 100 Days M. Noirtier was a true prophet, and things progressed rapidly, as he had predicted. Everyone knows the history of the famous return from Elba, a return which was unprecedented in the past, and will probably remain without a counterpart in the future. Louis XVIII made but a faint attempt to parry this unexpected blow. The monarchy he had scarcely reconstructed tottered on its precarious foundation, and at a sign from the emperor the incongruous structure of ancient prejudices and new ideas fell to the ground. Villefort, therefore, gained nothing save the king's gratitude, which was rather likely to injure him at the present time, and the cross of the Legion of Honor, which he had the prudence not to wear, although M. de Blocas had duly forwarded the brevet. Napoleon would, doubtless, have deprived Villefort of his office had it not been for Noirtier, who was all-powerful at court, and thus the Girondin of '93 and the Senator of 1806 protected him, who so lately had been his protector. All Villefort's influence barely enabled him to stifle the secret Dantès had so nearly divulged. The king's procureur alone was deprived of his office, being suspected of royalism. However, scarcely was the imperial power established. That is, scarcely had the emperor re-entered the Tuileries and begun to issue orders from the closet into which we have introduced our readers. He found on the table their Louis XVIII's half-filled snuff-box. Scarcely had this occurred when Marseilles began, in spite of the authorities, to rekindle the flames of civil war, always smoldering in the south, and it required but little to excite the populace to acts of far greater violence than the shouts and insults with which they assailed the royalists whenever they ventured abroad. 0159 Owing to this change, the worthy shipowner became at that moment, we will not say all-powerful, because Morel was a prudent and rather a timid man, so much so, that many of the most zealous partisans of Bonaparte accused him of moderation, but sufficiently influential to make a demand in favor of Dantès. Villefort retained his place, but his marriage was put off until a more favorable opportunity. If the emperor remained on the throne, Gerard required a different alliance to aid his career. If Louis XVIII returned, the influence of M. de Saint-Méran, like his own, could be vastly increased, and the marriage be still more suitable. The deputy procureur was, therefore, the first magistrate of Marseilles, when one morning his door opened, and M. Morel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to receive him, but Villefort was a man of ability, and he knew this would be a sign of weakness. He made Morel wait in the antechamber, although he had no one with him, for the simple reason that the king's procureur always makes everyone wait, and after passing a quarter of an hour in reading the papers, he ordered M. Morrel to be admitted. Morrel expected Villefort would be dejected. He found him as he had found him 6 weeks before, calm, firm, and full of that glacial politeness, that most insurmountable barrier which separates the well-bred from the vulgar man. He had entered Villefort's office expecting that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him. On the contrary, he felt a cold shudder all over him when he saw Villefort sitting there with his elbow on his desk, and his head leaning on his hand. He stopped at the door. Villefort gazed at him as if he had some difficulty in recognizing him. Then, after a brief interval, during which the honest shipowner turned his hat in his hands, "M. Morrel, I believe?" said Villefort. "Yes, sir." "Come nearer," said the magistrate, with a patronizing wave of the hand, "and tell me to what circumstance I owe the honor of this visit." "Do you not guess, monsieur?" asked Morrel. "Not in the least, but if I can serve you in any way I shall be delighted. Everything depends on you. Explain yourself, pray." "Monsieur," said Morrel, recovering his assurance as he proceeded, "do you recollect that a few days before the landing of His Majesty the Emperor, I came to intercede for a young man, the mate of my ship, who was accused of being concerned in correspondence with the island of Elba? What was the other day a crime is today a title to favor. You then served Louis XVIII, and you did not show any favor. It was your duty. Today you serve Napoleon, and you ought to protect him. It is equally your duty. I come, therefore, to ask what has become of him." 0161 M. Villefort by a strong effort sought to control himself. "What is his name?" said he. "Tell me his name." "Edmond Dantès." Villefort would probably have rather stood opposite the muzzle of a pistol at 25 paces than have heard this name spoken. But he did not blanch. "Dantès?" repeated he. "Edmond Dantès." "Yes, monsieur." Villefort opened a large register, then went to a table, from the table turned to his registers, and then, turning to Morrel, "Are you quite sure you are not mistaken, monsieur?" said he, in the most natural tone in the world. Had Morrel been a more quick-sighted man, or better versed in these matters, he would have been surprised at the king's procureur answering him on such a subject, instead of referring him to the governors of the prison or the prefect of the department. But Morrel, disappointed in his expectations of exciting fear, was conscious only of the other's condescension. Villefort had calculated rightly. "No," said Morrel, "I am not mistaken. I have known him for 10 years, the last 4 of which he was in my service. Do not you recollect, I came about 6 weeks ago to plead for clemency, as I come today to plead for justice. You received me very coldly. Oh, the royalists were very severe with the Bonapartists in those days." "Monsieur," returned Villefort, "I was then a royalist, because I believed the Bourbons not only the heirs to the throne, but the chosen of the nation. The miraculous return of Napoleon has conquered me. The legitimate monarch is he who is loved by his people." "That's right," cried Morrel. "I like to hear you speak thus, and I augur well for Edmond from it." "Wait a moment," said Villefort, turning over the leaves of a register. "I have it, a sailor who was about to marry a young Catalan girl. I recollect now, it was a very serious charge." "How so?" "You know that when he left here he was taken to the Palais de Justice. Well, I made my report to the authorities at Paris, and a week after he was carried off." "Carried off?" said Morrel. "What can they have done with him?" "Oh, he has been taken to Fenestrelles, to Pignerol, or to the Sainte Marguerite Islands. Some fine morning he will return to take command of your vessel. Come when he will, it shall be kept for him. But how is it he is not already returned? It seems to me the first care of government should be to set at liberty those who have suffered for their adherence to it." "Do not be too hasty, M. Morrel," replied Villefort. "The order of imprisonment came from high authority, and the order for his liberation must proceed from the same source. And, as Napoleon has scarcely been reinstated a fortnight, the letters have not yet been forwarded." "But," said Morrel, "is there no way of expediting all these formalities, of releasing him from arrest?" "There has been no arrest." "How?" "It is sometimes essential to government to cause a man's disappearance without leaving any traces, so that no written forms or documents may defeat their wishes. It might be so under the Bourbons, but at present, It has always been so, my dear Morel, since the reign of Louis XIV. The emperor is more strict in prison discipline than even Louis himself, and the number of prisoners whose names are not on the register is incalculable. Had Morel even any suspicions, so much kindness would have dispelled them. Well, M. de Villefort, how would you advise me to act? Asked he. Petition the minister. Oh, I know what that is. The minister receives 200 petitions every day and does not read 3. That is true, but he will read a petition countersigned and presented by me. And will you undertake to deliver it? With the greatest pleasure. Dantès was then guilty, and now he is innocent, and it is as much my duty to free him as it was to condemn him. Villefort thus forestalled any danger of an inquiry, which, however improbable it might be, if it did take place would leave him defenseless. But how shall I address the minister? Sit down there, said Villefort, giving up his place to Morel, and write what I dictate. Will you be so good? Certainly. But lose no time. We have lost too much already. That is true. Only think what the poor fellow may even now be suffering. Villefort shuddered at the suggestion. But he had gone too far to draw back. Dantès must be crushed to gratify Villefort's ambition. Villefort dictated a petition, in which, from an excellent intention, no doubt, Dantès' patriotic services were exaggerated, and he was made out one of the most active agents of Napoleon's return. It was evident that at the sight of this document the minister would instantly release him. The petition finished, Villefort read it aloud. That will do, said he. Leave the rest to me. Will the petition go soon? Today. Countersigned by you? The best thing I can do will be to certify the truth of the contents of your petition. And, sitting down, Villefort wrote the certificate at the bottom. What more is to be done? I will do whatever is necessary. This assurance delighted Morel, who took leave of Villefort, and hastened to announce to old Dantès that he would soon see his son. As for Villefort, instead of sending to Paris, he carefully preserved the petition that so fearfully compromised Dantès, in the hopes of an event that seemed not unlikely, that is, a second restoration. Dantès remained a prisoner and heard not the noise of the fall of Louis XVIII's throne, or the still more tragic destruction of the empire. Twice during the 100 days had Morel renewed his demand, and twice had Villefort soothed him with promises. At last there was Waterloo, and Morel came no more. He had done all that was in his power, and any fresh attempt would only compromise himself uselessly. Louis XVIII remounted the throne. Villefort, to whom Marseilles had become filled with remorseful memories, sought and obtained the situation of king's procureur at Toulouse, and a fortnight afterwards he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, whose father now stood higher at court than ever, and so Dantès, after the 100 days and after Waterloo, remained in his dungeon, forgotten of earth and heaven. Danglars comprehended the full extent of the wretched fate that overwhelmed Dantès, and, when Napoleon returned to France, he, after the manner of mediocre minds, termed the coincidence a decree of Providence. But when Napoleon returned to Paris, Danglars' heart failed him, and he lived in constant fear of Dantès' return on a mission of vengeance. He therefore informed M. Morel of his wish to quit the sea, and obtained a recommendation from him to a Spanish merchant, into whose service he entered at the end of March, that is, 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return. He then left for Madrid and was no more heard of. Fernand understood nothing except that Dantès was absent. What had become of him he cared not to inquire. Only, during the respite the absence of his rival afforded him, he reflected, partly on the means of deceiving Mercédès as to the cause of his absence, partly on plans of emigration and abduction, as from time to time he sat sad and motionless on the summit of Cape Pharaon, at the spot from whence Marseilles and the Catalans are visible, watching for the apparition of a young and handsome man, who was for him also the messenger of vengeance. Fernand's mind was made up. He would shoot Dantès and then kill himself. But Fernand was mistaken. A man of his disposition never kills himself, for he constantly hopes. During this time the empire made its last conscription, and every man in France capable of bearing arms rushed to obey the summons of the emperor. Fernand departed with the rest, bearing with him the terrible thought that while he was away, his rival would perhaps return and marry Mercédès. Had Fernand really meant to kill himself, he would have done so when he parted from Mercédès. His devotion, and the compassion he showed for her misfortunes produced the effect they always produce on noble minds. Mercédès had always had a sincere regard for Fernand, and this was now strengthened by gratitude. "My brother," said she, as she placed his knapsack on his shoulders, "be careful of yourself, for if you are killed, I shall be alone in the world." These words carried a ray of hope into Fernand's heart. Should Dantès not return, Mercédès might one day be his .0165. Mercédès was left alone face to face with the vast plain that had never seemed so barren, and the sea that had never seemed so vast. Bathed in tears, she wandered about the Catalan village. Sometimes she stood mute and motionless as a statue, looking towards Marseilles, at other times gazing on the sea, and debating as to whether it were not better to cast herself into the abyss of the ocean, and thus end her woes. It was not want of courage that prevented her putting this resolution into execution, but her religious feelings came to her aid and saved her. Catullus was, like Fernand, enrolled in the army, but, being married and 8 years older, he was merely sent to the frontier. Old Dantès, who was only sustained by hope, lost all hope at Napoleon's downfall. 5 months after he had been separated from his son, and almost at the hour of his arrest, he breathed his last in Mercédès' arms. Morel paid the expenses of his funeral and a few small debts the poor old man had contracted. There was more than benevolence in this action. There was courage, the South was aflame, and to assist, even on his deathbed, the father of so dangerous a Bonapartist as Dantès, was stigmatized as a crime. Chapter 14. The two prisoners' ire after Louis XVIII's restoration. A visit was made by the Inspector General of Prisons. Dantès in his cell heard the noise of preparation. Sounds that at the depth where he lay would have been inaudible to any but the ear of a prisoner, who could hear the splash of the drop of water that every hour fell from the roof of his dungeon. He guessed something uncommon was passing among the living, but he had so long ceased to have any intercourse with the world, that he looked upon himself as dead. The inspector visited, one after another, the cells and dungeons of several of the prisoners, whose good behavior or stupidity recommended them to the clemency of the government. He inquired how they were fed, and if they had any request to make. The universal response was that the fare was detestable and that they wanted to be set free. The inspector asked if they had anything else to ask for. They shook their heads. What could they desire beyond their liberty? The inspector turned smilingly to the governor. "I do not know what reason government can assign for these useless visits. When you see one prisoner, you see all, always the same thing, ill-fed and innocent. Are there any others?" "Yes. The dangerous and mad prisoners are in the dungeons." "Let us visit them," said the inspector with an air of fatigue. "We must play the farce to the end. Let us see the dungeons." "Let us first send for 2 soldiers," said the governor. "The prisoners sometimes, through mere uneasiness of life, and in order to be sentenced to death, commit acts of useless violence, and you might fall a victim." "Take all needful precautions," replied the inspector. 2 soldiers were accordingly sent for, and the inspector descended a stairway, so foul, so humid, so dark, as to be loathsome to sight, smell, and respiration. "Oh!" cried the inspector. "Who can live here? A most dangerous conspirator, a man we are ordered to keep the most strict watch over, as he is daring and resolute." "He is alone?" "Certainly." "How long has he been there?" "Nearly a year." "Was he placed here when he first arrived?" "No, not until he attempted to kill the turnkey who took his food to him." "To kill the turnkey?" "Yes, the very one who is lighting us." "Is it not true, Antoine?" asked the governor. "True enough, he wanted to kill me," returned the turnkey. "He must be mad," said the inspector. "He is worse than that. He is a devil," returned the turnkey. "Shall I complain of him?" demanded the inspector. "Oh no, it is useless. Besides, he is almost mad now, and in another year he will be quite so. So much the better for him. He will suffer less," said the inspector. He was, as this remark shows, a man full of philanthropy, and in every way fit for his office. "You are right, sir," replied the governor. "And this remark proves that you have deeply considered the subject. Now we have in a dungeon about 20 feet distant, and to which you descend by another stair, an old abbé, formerly leader of a party in Italy, who has been here since 1811, and in 1813 he went mad, and the change is astonishing. He used to weep, he now laughs. He grew thin, he now grows fat. You had better see him, for his madness is amusing." "I will see them both," returned the inspector. "I must conscientiously perform my duty." This was the inspector's first visit. He wished to display his authority. "Let us visit this one first," added he. "By all means," replied the governor, and he signed to the turnkey to open the door. At the sound of the key turning in the lock, and the creaking of the hinges, Dantès, who was crouched in a corner of the dungeon, whence he could see the ray of light that came through a narrow iron grating above, raised his head. Seeing a stranger, escorted by 2 turnkeys holding torches and accompanied by 2 soldiers, and to whom the governor spoke bareheaded, Dantès, who guessed the truth, and that the moment to address himself to the superior authorities was come, sprang forward with clasped hands. The soldiers interposed their bayonets, for they thought that he was about to attack the inspector, and the latter recoiled 2 or 3 steps. Dantès saw that he was looked upon as dangerous. Then, infusing all the humility he possessed into his eyes and voice, he addressed the inspector, and sought to inspire him with pity. The inspector listened attentively. Then, turning to the governor, observed, "He will become religious. He is already more gentle. He is afraid, and retreated before the bayonets. Madmen are not afraid of anything. I made some curious observations on this at Charenton." Then, turning to the prisoner, "What is it you want?" said he. "I want to know what crime I have committed, to be tried, and if I am guilty, to be shot, if innocent, to be set at liberty." "Are you well fed?" said the inspector. "I believe so. I don't know. It's of no consequence. What matters really, not only to me, but to officers of justice and the king, is that an innocent man should languish in prison, the victim of an infamous denunciation, to die here cursing his executioners." "You are very humble today," remarked the governor. "You are not so always, the other day, for instance, when you tried to kill the turnkey." "It is true, sir, and I beg his pardon, for he has always been very good to me, but I was mad." "And you are not so any longer?" "No, captivity has subdued me. I have been here so long." "So long? When were you arrested then?" asked the inspector. "The 28th of February, 1815, at 2:30 in the afternoon. Today is the 30th of July, 1816. Why, it is but 17 months. "Only 17 months," replied Dantès. "Oh, you do not know what is 17 months in prison." 17 ages rather, especially to a man who, like me, had arrived at the summit of his ambition, to a man who, like me, was on the point of marrying a woman he adored, who saw an honorable career opened before him, and who loses all in an instant, who sees his prospects destroyed, and is ignorant of the fate of his affianced wife, and whether his aged father be still living. 17 months' captivity to a sailor accustomed to the boundless ocean is a worse punishment than human crime ever merited. Have pity on me, then, and ask for me not intelligence, but a trial. Not pardon, but a verdict. A trial, sir. I ask only for a trial. That surely cannot be denied to one who is accused." "We shall see," said the inspector. Then, turning to the governor, "On my word, the poor devil touches me. You must show me the proofs against him." "Certainly, but you will find terrible charges." "Monsieur," continued Dantès, "I know it is not in your power to release me, but you can plead for me, you can have me tried, and that is all I ask. Let me know my crime, and the reason why I was condemned. Uncertainty is worse than all." "Go on with the lights," said the inspector. "Monsieur," cried Dantès, "I can tell by your voice you are touched with pity. Tell me at least a hope." "I cannot tell you that," replied the inspector. "I can only promise to examine into your case." "Oh, I am free. Then I am saved." "Who arrested you?" "M. Villefort. See him, and hear what he says." "M. Villefort is no longer at Marseilles. He is now at Toulouse." "I am no longer surprised at my detention," murmured Dantès, "since my only protector is removed. Had M. de Villefort any cause of personal dislike to you?" "None. On the contrary, he was very kind to me." "I can, then, rely on the notes he has left concerning you?" "Entirely." "That is well. Wait patiently, then." Dantès fell on his knees and prayed earnestly. The door closed, but this time a fresh inmate was left with Dantès. Hope.0173M. Will you see the register at once? Asked the governor. Or proceed to the other cell? Let us visit them all, said the inspector. If I once went up those stairs, I should never have the courage to come down again. Ah, this one is not like the other, and his madness is less affecting than this one's display of reason. What is his folly? He fancies he possesses an immense treasure. The first year he offered government 1,000,000 of francs for his release, the second 2, the third 3, and so on progressively. He is now in his 5th year of captivity. He will ask to speak to you in private and offer you 5 millions. How curious! What is his name? The Abbé Faria. Number 27, said the inspector. It is here. Unlock the door, Antoine. The turnkey obeyed, and the inspector gazed curiously into the chamber of the mad abbé, as the prisoner was usually called. In the center of the cell, in a circle traced with a fragment of plaster detached from the wall, sat a man whose tattered garments scarcely covered him. He was drawing in this circle geometrical lines, and seemed as much absorbed in his problem as Archimedes was when the soldier of Marseilles slew him. He did not move at the sound of the door, and continued his calculations until the flash of the torches lighted up with an unwonted glare the somber walls of his cell. Then, raising his head, he perceived with astonishment the number of persons present. He hastily seized the coverlid of his bed and wrapped it round him. "What is it you want?" said the inspector. "I, monsieur," replied the abbé with an air of surprise. "I want nothing." "You do not understand," continued the inspector. "I am sent here by government to visit the prison and hear the requests of the prisoners." "Oh, that is different," cried the abbé. "And we shall understand each other, I hope." "There now," whispered the governor. "It is just as I told you." "Monsieur," continued the prisoner, "I am the Abbé Faria, born at Rome. I was for 20 years Cardinal Spada's secretary. I was arrested, why, I know not, toward the beginning of the year 1811. Since then I have demanded my liberty from the Italian and French government." "Why from the French government?" "Because I was arrested at Piombino, and I presume that, like Milan and Florence, Piombino has become the capital of some French department." "Ah," said the inspector, "you have not the latest news from Italy?" "My information dates from the day on which I was arrested," returned the Abbé Faria. "And as the emperor had created the kingdom of Rome for his infant son, I presume that he has realized the dream of Machiavelli and Caesar Borgia, which was to make Italy a united kingdom." "Monsieur," returned the inspector, "Providence has changed this gigantic plan you advocate so warmly. It is the only means of rendering Italy strong, happy, and independent." "Very possibly. Only I am not come to discuss politics, but to inquire if you have anything to ask or to complain of. The food is the same as in other prisons. That is, very bad. The lodging is very unhealthful, but on the whole passable for a dungeon. But it is not that which I wish to speak of, but a secret I have to reveal of the greatest importance." "We are coming to the point," whispered the governor. "It is for that reason I am delighted to see you," continued the abbé, "although you have disturbed me in a most important calculation, which, if it succeeded, would possibly change Newton's system. Could you allow me a few words in private?" "What did I tell you?" said the governor. "You knew him," returned the inspector with a smile. "What you ask is impossible, monsieur," continued he, addressing Faria.0175M. "But," said the abbé, "I would speak to you of a large sum amounting to 5 millions. "The very sum you named," whispered the inspector in his turn. "However," continued Faria, seeing that the inspector was about to depart, "it is not absolutely necessary for us to be alone. The governor can be present." "Unfortunately," said the governor, "I know beforehand what you are about to say. It concerns your treasures, does it not?" Faria fixed his eyes on him with an expression that would have convinced anyone else of his sanity. "Of course," said he. "Of what else should I speak?" "Mr. Inspector," continued the governor, "I can tell you the story as well as he, for it has been dinned in my ears for the last 4 or 5 years. "That proves," returned the abbé, "that you are like those of Holy Writ, who having eyes see not, and having ears hear not." "My dear sir, the government is rich and does not want your treasures," replied the inspector. "Keep them until you are liberated." The abbé's eyes glistened. He seized the inspector's hand. "But what if I am not liberated," cried he, "and am detained here until my death? This treasure will be lost. Had not government better profit by it? I will offer 6 millions, and I will content myself with the rest, if they will only give me my liberty." "On my word," said the inspector in a low tone, "had I not been told beforehand that this man was mad, I should believe what he says." "I am not mad," replied Faria, with that acuteness of hearing peculiar to prisoners. "The treasure I speak of really exists, and I offer to sign an agreement with you, in which I promise to lead you to the spot where you shall dig. And if I deceive you, bring me here again. I ask no more." The governor laughed. "Is the spot far from here?" "100 leagues. "It is not ill-planned," said the governor. "If all the prisoners took it into their heads to travel 100 leagues, and their guardians consented to accompany them, they would have a capital chance of escaping." "The scheme is well known," said the inspector, "and the abbé's plan has not even the merit of originality." Then turning to Faria, "I inquired if you are well fed?" said he. "Swear to me," replied Faria, "to free me if what I tell you prove true, and I will stay here while you go to the spot." "Are you well fed?" repeated the inspector. "Monsieur, you run no risk, for, as I told you, I will stay here, so there is no chance of my escaping." "You do not reply to my question," replied the inspector impatiently. "Nor you to mine," cried the abbé. "You will not accept my gold. I will keep it for myself. You refuse me my liberty. God will give it me." And the abbé, casting away his coverlet, resumed his place, and continued his calculations. 0177 m. "What is he doing there?" said the inspector. "Counting his treasures," replied the governor. Faria replied to this sarcasm with a glance of profound contempt. They went out. The turnkey closed the door behind them. "He was wealthy once, perhaps?" said the inspector. "Or dreamed he was and awoke mad." "After all," said the inspector, "if he had been rich, he would not have been here." So the matter ended for the Abbé Faria. He remained in his cell, and this visit only increased the belief in his insanity. Caligula or Nero, those treasure-seekers, those desirers of the impossible, would have accorded to the poor wretch, in exchange for his wealth, the liberty he so earnestly prayed for. But the kings of modern times, restrained by the limits of mere probability, have neither courage nor desire. They fear the ear that hears their orders, and the eye that scrutinizes their actions. Formerly they believed themselves sprung from Jupiter and shielded by their birth. But nowadays they are not inviolable. It has always been against the policy of despotic governments to suffer the victims of their persecutions to reappear. As the Inquisition rarely allowed its victims to be seen with their limbs distorted and their flesh lacerated by torture, so madness is always concealed in its cell, from whence, should it depart, it is conveyed to some gloomy hospital, where the doctor has no thought for man or mind in the mutilated being the jailer delivers to him. The very madness of the Abbé Faria, gone mad in prison, condemned him to perpetual captivity. The inspector kept his word with Dantès. He examined the register and found the following note concerning him: Edmond Dantès, violent Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from Elba, the greatest watchfulness and care to be exercised. This note was in a different hand from the rest, which showed that it had been added since his confinement. The inspector could not contend against this accusation. He simply wrote, "Nothing to be done." This visit had infused new vigor into Dantès. He had, till then, forgotten the date, but now, with a fragment of plaster, he wrote the date, July 30th, 1816, and made a mark every day, in order not to lose his reckoning again. Days and weeks passed away, then months. Dantès still waited. He at first expected to be freed in a fortnight. This fortnight expired. He decided that the inspector would do nothing until his return to Paris, and that he would not reach there until his circuit was finished. He therefore fixed 3 months. 3 months passed away, then 6 more. Finally 10 months and a half had gone by and no favorable change had taken place, and Dantès began to fancy the inspector's visit but a dream, an illusion of the brain. At the expiration of a year the governor was transferred. He had obtained charge of the fortress at Ham. He took with him several of his subordinates, and amongst them Dantès' jailer. A new governor arrived. It would have been too tedious to acquire the names of the prisoners. He learned their numbers instead. This horrible place contained 50 cells. Their inhabitants were designated by the numbers of their cell, and the unhappy young man was no longer called Edmond Dantès. He was now number 34. The inspector kept his word with Dantès. He examined the register and found the following note concerning him. Edmond Dantès, violent Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from Elba, the greatest watchfulness and care to be exercised. This note was in a different hand from the rest, which showed that it had been added since his confinement. The inspector could not contend against this accusation. He simply wrote, "Nothing to be done." This visit had infused new vigor into Dantès. He had, till then, forgotten the date, but now, with a fragment of plaster, he wrote the date, July 30th, 1816, and made a mark every day, in order not to lose his reckoning again. Days and weeks passed away, then months. Dantès still waited. He at first expected to be freed in a fortnight. This fortnight expired. He decided that the inspector would do nothing until his return to Paris, and that he would not reach there until his circuit was finished. He therefore fixed 3 months. 3 months passed away, then 6 more. Finally 10 months and a half had gone by and no favorable change had taken place, and Dantès began to fancy the inspector's visit but a dream, an illusion of the brain that at the expiration of a year the governor was transferred. He had obtained charge of the fortress at Ham. He took with him several of his subordinates, and amongst them Dantès' jailer. A new governor arrived. It would have been too tedious to acquire the names of the prisoners. He learned their numbers instead. This horrible place contained 50 cells. Their inhabitants were designated by the numbers of their cell, and the unhappy young man was no longer called Edmond Dantès. He was now number 34. Chapter 15. Number 34 and number 27. Dantès passed through all the stages of torture natural to prisoners in suspense. He was sustained at first by that pride of conscious innocence which is the sequence to hope. Then he began to doubt his own innocence, which justified in some measure the governor's belief in his mental alienation. And then, relaxing his sentiment of pride, he addressed his supplications not to God but to man. God is always the last resource. Unfortunates, who ought to begin with God, do not have any hope in him till they have exhausted all other means of deliverance. Dantès asked to be removed from his present dungeon into another, even if it were darker and deeper, for a change, however disadvantageous, was still a change, and would afford him some amusement. He entreated to be allowed to walk about, to have fresh air, books, and writing materials. His requests were not granted, but he went on asking all the same. He accustomed himself to speaking to the new jailer, although the latter was, if possible, more taciturn than the old one. But still, to speak to a man, even though mute, was something. Dantès spoke for the sake of hearing his own voice. He had tried to speak when alone, but the sound of his voice terrified him. Often, before his captivity, Dantès' mind had revolted at the idea of assemblages of prisoners, made up of thieves, vagabonds, and murderers. He now wished to be amongst them, in order to see some other face besides that of his jailer. He sighed for the galleys, with the infamous costume, the chain, and the brand on the shoulder. The galley slaves breathed the fresh air of heaven, and saw each other. They were very happy. He besought the jailer one day to let him have a companion, were it even the mad abbé. The jailer, though rough and hardened by the constant sight of so much suffering, was yet a man. At the bottom of his heart he had often had a feeling of pity for this unhappy young man who suffered so, and he laid the request of number 34 before the governor. But the latter sapiently imagined that Dantès wished to conspire or attempt an escape, and refused his request. Dantès had exhausted all human resources, and he then turned to God. All the pious ideas that had been so long forgotten returned. He recollected the prayers his mother had taught him, and discovered a new meaning in every word. For in prosperity prayers seem but a mere medley of words, until misfortune comes and the unhappy sufferer first understands the meaning of the sublime language in which he invokes the pity of heaven. He prayed, and prayed aloud, no longer terrified at the sound of his own voice, for he fell into a sort of ecstasy. He laid every action of his life before the Almighty, proposed tasks to accomplish, and at the end of every prayer introduced the entreaty oftener addressed to man than to God. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. Yet in spite of his earnest prayers, Dantès remained a prisoner. Then gloom settled heavily upon him. Dantès was a man of great simplicity of thought and without education. He could not, therefore, in the solitude of his dungeon, traverse in mental vision the history of the ages, bring to life the nations that had perished, and rebuild the ancient cities so vast and stupendous in the light of the imagination, and that pass before the eye glowing with celestial colors in Martin's Babylonian pictures. He could not do this, he whose past life was so short, whose present so melancholy, and his future so doubtful. 19 years of light to reflect upon in eternal darkness. No distraction could come to his aid. His energetic spirit, that would have exalted in thus revisiting the past, was imprisoned like an eagle in a cage. He clung to one idea, that of his happiness, destroyed, without apparent cause, by an unheard of fatality. He considered and reconsidered this idea, devoured it, so to speak, as the implacable Ugolino devours the skull of Archbishop Roger in the Inferno of Dante. Rage supplanted religious fervor. Dantès uttered blasphemies that made his jailer recoil with horror, dashed himself furiously against the walls of his prison, wreaked his anger upon everything, and chiefly upon himself, so that the least thing, a grain of sand, a straw, or a breath of air that annoyed him, led to paroxysms of fury. Then the letter that Villefort had showed to him recurred to his mind, and every line gleamed forth in fiery letters on the wall like the mean, Tekel Upharsin of Belshazzar. He told himself that it was the enmity of man, and not the vengeance of heaven, that had thus plunged him into the deepest misery. He consigned his unknown persecutors to the most horrible tortures he could imagine, and found them all insufficient, because after torture came death, and after death, if not repose, at least the boon of unconsciousness. By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquility was death, and if punishment were the end in view, other tortures than death must be invented, he began to reflect on suicide. Unhappy he, who, on the brink of misfortune, broods over ideas like these. Before him is a dead sea that stretches in azure calm before the eye, but he who unwarily ventures within its embrace finds himself struggling with a monster that would drag him down to perdition. Once thus ensnared, unless the protecting hand of God snatch him thence, all is over, and his struggles but tend to hasten his destruction. This state of mental anguish is, however, less terrible than the sufferings that precede or the punishment that possibly will follow. There is a sort of consolation at the contemplation of the yawning abyss, at the bottom of which lie darkness and obscurity. Edmond found some solace in these ideas. All his sorrows, all his sufferings, with their train of gloomy specters, fled from his cell when the angel of death seemed about to enter. Dantès reviewed his past life with composure, and, looking forward with terror to his future existence, chose that middle line that seemed to afford him a refuge. "Sometimes," said he, "in my voyages, when I was a man and commanded other men, I have seen the heavens overcast, the sea rage and foam, the storm arise, and like a monstrous bird, beating the two horizons with its wings. Then I felt that my vessel was a vain refuge, that trembled and shook before the tempest. Soon the fury of the waves and the sight of the sharp rocks announced the approach of death, and death then terrified me, and I used all my skill and intelligence as a man and a sailor to struggle against the wrath of God. But I did so because I was happy, because I had not courted death, because to be cast upon a bed of rocks and seaweed seemed terrible, because I was unwilling that I, a creature made for the service of God, should serve for food to the gulls and ravens. But now it is different. I have lost all that bound me to life, death smiles and invites me to repose. I die after my own manner, I die exhausted and broken-spirited, as I fall asleep when I have paced 3,000 times round my cell. That is 30,000 steps or about 10 leagues. No sooner had this idea taken possession of him than he became more composed, arranged his couch to the best of his power, ate little and slept less, and found existence almost supportable, because he felt that he could throw it off at pleasure, like a worn-out garment. Two methods of self-destruction were at his disposal. He could hang himself with his handkerchief to the window bars, or refuse food and die of starvation. But the first was repugnant to him. Dantès had always entertained the greatest horror of pirates, who are hung up to the yardarm. He would not die by what seemed an infamous death. He resolved to adopt the second, and began that day to carry out his resolve. 0185 Nearly 4 years had passed away. At the end of the second he had ceased to mark the lapse of time. Dantès said, "I wish to die," and had chosen the manner of his death, and fearful of changing his mind, he had taken an oath to die. "When my morning and evening meals are brought," thought he, "I will cast them out of the window, and they will think that I have eaten them." He kept his word. Twice a day he cast out, through the barred aperture, the provisions his jailer brought him, at first gaily, then with deliberation, and at last with regret. Nothing but the recollection of his oath gave him strength to proceed. Hunger made viands once repugnant now acceptable. He held the plate in his hand for an hour at a time, and gazed thoughtfully at the morsel of bad meat, of tainted fish, of black and moldy bread. It was the last yearning for life contending with the resolution of despair. Then his dungeon seemed less somber, his prospects less desperate. He was still young, he was only 4 or 25, he had nearly 50 years to live. Then he raised to his lips the repast that, like a voluntary Tantalus, he refused himself, but he thought of his oath and he would not break it. He persisted until, at last, he had not sufficient strength to rise and cast his supper out of the loophole. The next morning he could not see or hear. The jailer feared he was dangerously ill. Edmond hoped he was dying. Thus the day passed away. Edmond felt a sort of stupor creeping over him which brought with it a feeling almost of content. The gnawing pain at his stomach had ceased. His thirst had abated. When he closed his eyes he saw myriads of lights dancing before them like the will-o'-the-wisps that play about the marshes. It was the twilight of that mysterious country called Death. Suddenly, about 9 o'clock in the evening, Edmond heard a hollow sound in the wall against which he was lying. So many loathsome animals inhabited the prison, that their noise did not, in general, awake him. But whether abstinence had quickened his faculties, or whether the noise was really louder than usual, Edmond raised his head and listened. It was a continual scratching, as if made by a huge claw, a powerful tooth, or some iron instrument attacking the stones. Although weakened, the young man's brain instantly responded to the idea that haunts all prisoners: liberty. It seemed to him that heaven had at length taken pity on him, and had sent this noise to warn him on the very brink of the abyss. Perhaps one of those beloved ones he had so often thought of was thinking of him, and striving to diminish the distance that separated them. And oh no, doubtless he was deceived, and it was but one of those dreams that forerun death. Edmond still heard the sound. It lasted nearly 3 hours. He then heard a noise of something falling, and all was silent. Some hours afterwards it began again, nearer and more distinct. Edmond was intensely interested. Suddenly the jailer entered. For a week since he had resolved to die, and during the 4 days that he had been carrying out his purpose, Edmond had not spoken to the attendant, had not answered him when he inquired what was the matter with him, and turned his face to the wall when he looked too curiously at him. But now the jailer might hear the noise and put an end to it, and so destroy a ray of something like hope that soothed his last moments. The jailer brought him his breakfast. Dantès raised himself up and began to talk about everything. About the bad quality of the food, about the coldness of his dungeon, grumbling and complaining, in order to have an excuse for speaking louder, and wearying the patience of his jailer, who out of kindness of heart had brought broth and white bread for his prisoner. Fortunately, he fancied that Dantès was delirious, and placing the food on the rickety table, he withdrew. Edmond listened, and the sound became more and more distinct. There can be no doubt about it, thought he. It is some prisoner who is striving to obtain his freedom. Oh, if I were only there to help him! Suddenly another idea took possession of his mind, so used to misfortune, that it was scarcely capable of hope. The idea that the noise was made by workmen the governor had ordered to repair the neighboring dungeon. It was easy to ascertain this. But how could he risk the question? It was easy to call his jailer's attention to the noise, and watch his countenance as he listened. But might he not by this means destroy hopes far more important than the short-lived satisfaction of his own curiosity? Unfortunately, Edmond's brain was still so feeble that he could not bend his thoughts to anything in particular. He saw but one means of restoring lucidity and clearness to his judgment. He turned his eyes towards the soup which the jailer had brought, rose, staggered towards it, raised the vessel to his lips, and drank off the contents with a feeling of indescribable pleasure. He had the resolution to stop with this. He had often heard that shipwrecked persons had died through having eagerly devoured too much food. Edmond replaced on the table the bread he was about to devour and returned to his couch. He did not wish to die. He soon felt that his ideas became again collected. He could think and strengthen his thoughts by reasoning. Then he said to himself, "I must put this to the test, but without compromising anybody. If it is a workman, I need but knock against the wall and he will cease to work in order to find out who is knocking and why he does so. But as his occupation is sanctioned by the governor, he will soon resume it. If, on the contrary, it is a prisoner, the noise I make will alarm him. He will cease, and not begin again until he thinks everyone is asleep." Edmond rose again, but this time his legs did not tremble, and his sight was clear. He went to a corner of his dungeon, detached a stone, and with it knocked against the wall where the sound came. He struck thrice. At the first blow the sound ceased. As if by magic, Edmond listened intently. An hour passed, 2 hours passed, and no sound was heard from the wall. All was silent there. Full of hope, Edmond swallowed a few mouthfuls of bread and water, and, thanks to the vigor of his constitution, found himself well nigh recovered. The day passed away in utter silence. Night came without recurrence of the noise. "It is a prisoner," said Edmond joyfully. His brain was on fire, and life and energy returned. The night passed in perfect silence. Edmond did not close his eyes. In the morning the jailer brought him fresh provisions. He had already devoured those of the previous day. He ate these, listening anxiously for the sound, walking round and round his cell, shaking the iron bars of the loophole, restoring vigor and agility to his limbs by exercise, and so preparing himself for his future destiny. At intervals he listened to learn if the noise had not begun again, and grew impatient at the prudence of the prisoner, who did not guess he had been disturbed by a captive as anxious for liberty as himself. 3 days passed. 72 long tedious hours which he counted off by minutes. At length one evening, as the jailer was visiting him for the last time that night, Dantès, with his ear for the 100th time at the wall, fancied he heard an almost imperceptible movement among the stones. He moved away, walked up and down his cell to collect his thoughts, and then went back and listened. The matter was no longer doubtful. Something was at work on the other side of the wall. The prisoner had discovered the danger, and had substituted a lever for a chisel. Encouraged by this discovery, Edmond determined to assist the indefatigable laborer. He began by moving his bed, and looked around for anything with which he could pierce the wall, penetrate the moist cement, and displace a stone. He saw nothing. He had no knife or sharp instrument. The window grating was of iron, but he had too often assured himself of its solidity. All his furniture consisted of a bed, a chair, a table, a pail, and a jug. The bed had iron clamps, but they were screwed to the wood, and it would have required a screwdriver to take them off. The table and chair had nothing. The pail had once possessed a handle, but that had been removed. 0189 Dantès had but one resource, which was to break the jug, and with one of the sharp fragments attack the wall. He let the jug fall on the floor, and it broke in pieces. Dantès concealed 2 or 3 of the sharpest fragments in his bed, leaving the rest on the floor. The breaking of his jug was too natural an accident to excite suspicion. Edmond had all the night to work in, but in the darkness he could not do much, and he soon felt that he was working against something very hard. He pushed back his bed, and waited for day. All night he heard the subterranean workman, who continued to mine his way. Day came, the jailer entered. Dantès told him that the jug had fallen from his hands while he was drinking, and the jailer went grumblingly to fetch another, without giving himself the trouble to remove the fragments of the broken one. He returned speedily, advised the prisoner to be more careful, and departed. Dantès heard joyfully the key grate in the lock. He listened until the sound of steps died away, and then, hastily displacing his bed, saw by the faint light that penetrated into his cell, that he had labored uselessly the previous evening in attacking the stone instead of removing the plaster that surrounded it. The damp had rendered it friable, and Dantès was able to break it off. In small morsels, it is true, but at the end of half an hour he had scraped off a handful. A mathematician might have calculated that in 2 years, supposing that the rock was not encountered, a passage 20 feet long and 2 feet broad might be formed. The prisoner reproached himself with not having thus employed the hours he had passed in vain hopes, prayer, and despondency. During the 6 years that he had been imprisoned, what might he not have accomplished? This idea imparted new energy, and in 3 days he had succeeded, with the utmost precaution, in removing the cement and exposing the stonework. The wall was built of rough stones, among which, to give strength to the structure, blocks of hewn stone were at intervals embedded. It was one of these he had uncovered, and which he must remove from its socket. Dantès strove to do this with his nails, but they were too weak. The fragments of the jug broke, and after an hour of useless toil, Dantès paused with anguish on his brow. Was he to be thus stopped at the beginning? And was he to wait inactive until his fellow workman had completed his task? Suddenly an idea occurred to him. He smiled, and the perspiration dried on his forehead. The jailer always brought Dantès soup in an iron saucepan. This saucepan contained soup for both prisoners, for Dantès had noticed that it was either quite full or half empty, according as the turnkey gave it to him or to his companion first. The handle of this saucepan was of iron. Dantès would have given 10 years of his life in exchange for it. 0.0191 m. The jailer was accustomed to pour the contents of the saucepan into Dantès' plate, and Dantès, after eating his soup with a wooden spoon, washed the plate, which thus served for every day. Now when evening came, Dantès put his plate on the ground near the door. The jailer, as he entered, stepped on it and broke it. This time he could not blame Dantès. He was wrong to leave it there, but the jailer was wrong not to have looked before him. The jailer, therefore, only grumbled. Then he looked about for something to pour the soup into. Dantès' entire dinner service consisted of one plate. There was no alternative. "Leave the saucepan," said Dantès. "You can take it away when you bring me my breakfast." This advice was to the jailer's taste, as it spared him the necessity of making another trip. He left the saucepan. Dantès was beside himself with joy. He rapidly devoured his food, and after waiting an hour, lest the jailer should change his mind and return, he removed his bed, took the handle of the saucepan, inserted the point between the hewn stone and rough stones of the wall, and employed it as a lever. A slight oscillation showed Dantès that all went well. At the end of an hour, the stone was extricated from the wall, leaving a cavity 1.5 feet in diameter. Dantès carefully collected the plaster, carried it into the corner of his cell, and covered it with earth. Then, wishing to make the best use of his time while he had the means of labor, he continued to work without ceasing. At the dawn of day he replaced the stone, pushed his bed against the wall, and lay down. The breakfast consisted of a piece of bread. The jailer entered and placed the bread on the table. "Well, don't you intend to bring me another plate?" said Dantès. "No," replied the turnkey. "You destroy everything. First you break your jug, then you make me break your plate. If all the prisoners followed your example, the government would be ruined. I shall leave you the saucepan and pour your soup into that. So for the future I hope you will not be so destructive." Dantès raised his eyes to heaven and clasped his hands beneath the coverlet. He felt more gratitude for the possession of this piece of iron than he had ever felt for anything. He had noticed, however, that the prisoner on the other side had ceased to labor. No matter, this was a greater reason for proceeding. If his neighbor would not come to him, he would go to his neighbor. All day he toiled on untiringly, and by the evening he had succeeded in extracting 10 handfuls of plaster and fragments of stone. When the hour for his jailer's visit arrived, Dantès straightened the handle of the saucepan as well as he could, and placed it in its accustomed place. The turnkey poured his ration of soup into it, together with the fish. For thrice a week the prisoners were deprived of meat. This would have been a method of reckoning time, had not Dantès long ceased to do so. Having poured out the soup, the turnkey retired. Dantès wished to ascertain whether his neighbor had really ceased to work. He listened. All was silent, as it had been for the last 3 days. Dantès sighed. It was evident that his neighbor distrusted him. However, he toiled on all the night without being discouraged. But after 2 or 3 hours he encountered an obstacle. The iron made no impression, but met with a smooth surface. Dantès touched it and found that it was a beam. This beam crossed, or rather blocked up, the hole Dantès had made. It was necessary, therefore, to dig above or under it. The unhappy young man had not thought of this. "Oh, my God, murmured he. "I have so earnestly prayed to you that I hoped my prayers had been heard. After having deprived me of my liberty, after having deprived me of death, after having recalled me to existence, my God, have pity on me, and do not let me die in despair. 0193M, who talks of God and despair at the same time? Said a voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth, and, deadened by the distance, sounded hollow and sepulchral in the young man's ears. Edmond's hair stood on end, and he rose to his knees. "Ah," said he, "I hear a human voice." Edmond had not heard anyone speak save his jailer for 4 or 5 years, and a jailer is no man to a prisoner. He is a living door, a barrier of flesh and blood adding strength to restraints of oak and iron. "In the name of heaven," cried Dantès, "speak again, though the sound of your voice terrifies me." "Who are you? Who are you?" said the voice. "An unhappy prisoner," replied Dantès, who made no hesitation in answering. "Of what country?" "A Frenchman." "Your name?" "Edmond Dantès." "Your profession?" "A sailor." "How long have you been here?" "Since the 28th of February, 1815. "Your crime?" "I am innocent." "But of what are you accused?" "Of having conspired to aid the emperor's return." "What, for the emperor's return?" "The emperor is no longer on the throne, then. He abdicated at Fontainebleau in 1814 and was sent to the island of Elba." "But how long have you been here that you are ignorant of all this?" "Since 1811. Dantès shuddered. This man had been 4 years longer than himself in prison. "Do not dig any more," said the voice. "Only tell me how high up is your excavation?" "On a level with the floor." "How is it concealed?" "Behind my bed." "Has your bed been moved since you have been a prisoner?" "No." "What does your chamber open on?" "A corridor." "And the corridor?" "On a court." "Alas!" murmured the voice. "Oh, what is the matter?" cried Dantès. "I have made a mistake owing to an error in my plans. I took the wrong angle and have come out 15 feet from where I intended. I took the wall you are mining for the outer wall of the fortress." "But then you would be close to the sea?" "That is what I hoped." "And supposing you had succeeded?" "I should have thrown myself into the sea, gained one of the islands near here, the Isle de Daume or the Isle de Tibelin, and then I should have been safe." "Could you have swum so far?" "Heaven would have given me strength. But now all is lost." "All?" "Yes. Stop up your excavation carefully, do not work any more, and wait until you hear from me. Tell me, at least, who you are." I am number 27. "You mistrust me, then?" said Dantès. Edmond fancied he heard a bitter laugh resounding from the depths. "Oh, I am a Christian," cried Dantès, guessing instinctively that this man meant to abandon him. "I swear to you by him who died for us that naught shall induce me to breathe one syllable to my jailers. But I conjure you do not abandon me. If you do, I swear to you, for I have got to the end of my strength, that I will dash my brains out against the wall, and you will have my death to reproach yourself with. How old are you?" "Your voice is that of a young man." Chapter 16. A learned Italian seizing in his arms the friend so long and ardently desired, Dantès almost carried him towards the window, in order to obtain a better view of his features by the aid of the imperfect light that struggled through the grating. He was a man of small stature, with hair blanched rather by suffering and sorrow than by age. He had a deep-set, penetrating eye, almost buried beneath the thick gray eyebrow, and a long and still black beard reaching down to his breast. His thin face, deeply furrowed by care, and the bold outline of his strongly marked features, betokened a man more accustomed to exercise his mental faculties than his physical strength. Large drops of perspiration were now standing on his brow, while the garments that hung about him were so ragged that one could only guess at the pattern upon which they had originally been fashioned. The stranger might have numbered 60 or 65 years, but a certain briskness and appearance of vigor in his movements made it probable that he was aged more from captivity than the course of time. He received the enthusiastic greeting of his young acquaintance with evident pleasure, as though his chilled affections were rekindled and invigorated by his contact with one so warm and ardent. He thanked him with grateful cordiality for his kindly welcome, although he must at that moment have been suffering bitterly to find another dungeon where he had fondly reckoned on discovering a means of regaining his liberty. "Let us first see," said he, "whether it is possible to remove the traces of my entrance here, Our future tranquility depends upon our jailers being entirely ignorant of it. Advancing to the opening, he stooped and raised the stone easily in spite of its weight. Then, fitting it into its place, he said, "You removed this stone very carelessly, but I suppose you had no tools to aid you." "Why?" exclaimed Dantès with astonishment. "Do you possess any?" "I made myself some, and with the exception of a file, I have all that are necessary, a chisel, pincers, and lever." 0201MO. How I should like to see these products of your industry and patience. "Well, in the first place, here is my chisel." So saying, he displayed a sharp, strong blade with a handle made of beechwood. "And with what did you contrive to make that?" inquired Dantès. "With one of the clamps of my bedstead, and this very tool has sufficed me to hollow out the road by which I came hither, a distance of about 50 feet. 50 feet! responded Dantès, almost terrified. "Do not speak so loud, young man, don't speak so loud. It frequently occurs in a state prison like this, that persons are stationed outside the doors of the cells purposely to overhear the conversation of the prisoners. But they believe I am shut up alone here. That makes no difference. And you say that you dug your way a distance of 50 feet to get here?" "I do. That is about the distance that separates your chamber from mine. Only, unfortunately, I did not curve aright. For want of the necessary geometrical instruments to calculate my scale of proportion, instead of taking an ellipsis of 40 feet, I made it 50. I expected, as I told you, to reach the outer wall, pierce through it, and throw myself into the sea. I have, however, kept along the corridor on which your chamber opens, instead of going beneath it. My labor is all in vain, for I find that the corridor looks into a courtyard filled with soldiers." "That's true," said Dantès. "But the corridor you speak of only bounds one side of my cell. There are 3 others. Do you know anything of their situation?" "This one is built against the solid rock, and it would take 10 experienced miners, duly furnished with the requisite tools, as many years to perforate it. This adjoins the lower part of the governor's apartments, and were we to work our way through, we should only get into some lock-up cellars, where we must necessarily be recaptured. The 4th and last side of your cell faces on." "Faces on. Stop a minute now, where does it face?" The wall of which he spoke was the one in which was fixed the loophole by which light was admitted to the chamber. This loophole, which gradually diminished in size as it approached the outside, to an opening through which a child could not have passed, was, for better security, furnished with 3 iron bars, so as to quiet all apprehensions even in the mind of the most suspicious jailer as to the possibility of a prisoner's escape. As the stranger asked the question, he dragged the table beneath the window. "Climb up," said he to Dantès. The young man obeyed, mounted on the table, and, divining the wishes of his companion, placed his back securely against the wall and held out both hands. The stranger, whom as yet Dantès knew only by the number of his cell, sprang up with an agility by no means to be expected in a person of his years, and, light and steady on his feet as a cat or a lizard, climbed from the table to the outstretched hands of Dantès, and from them to his shoulders. Then, bending double, for the ceiling of the dungeon prevented him from holding himself erect, he managed to slip his head between the upper bars of the window, so as to be able to command a perfect view from top to bottom. At an instant afterwards he hastily drew back his head, saying, "I thought so," and sliding from the shoulders of Dantès as dexterously as he had ascended, he nimbly leaped from the table to the ground. "What was it that you thought?" asked the young man anxiously, in his turn descending from the table. The elder prisoner pondered the matter. "Yes," said he at length, "it is so. This side of your chamber looks out upon a kind of open gallery, where patrols are continually passing, and sentries keep watch day and night." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain. I saw the soldier's shape and the top of his musket. That made me draw in my head so quickly, for I was fearful he might also see me." "Well?" inquired Dantès. "You perceive then the utter impossibility of escaping through your dungeon?" "Then," pursued the young man eagerly, "then," answered the elder prisoner, "the will of God be done." And as the old man slowly pronounced those words, an air of profound resignation spread itself over his careworn countenance. Dantès gazed on the man who could thus philosophically resign hopes so long and ardently nourished with an astonishment mingled with admiration. "Tell me, I entreat of you, who and what you are," said he at length. Never have I met with so remarkable a person as yourself. Willingly, answered the stranger. If, indeed, you feel any curiosity respecting one, now, alas, powerless to aid you in any way, say not so. You can console and support me by the strength of your own powerful mind. Pray let me know who you really are. The stranger smiled a melancholy smile. Then listen, said he. I am the Abbé Faria and have been imprisoned, as you know, in the Château d'If since the year 1811, previously to which I had been confined for 3 years in the fortress of Fenestrelle. In the year 1811 I was transferred to Piedmont in France. It was at this period I learned that the destiny which seemed subservient to every wish formed by Napoleon had bestowed on him a son, named King of Rome even in his cradle. I was very far then from expecting the change you have just informed me of, namely that 4 years afterwards this colossus of power would be overthrown. Then who reigns in France at this moment? Napoleon II? No, Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI. How inscrutable are the ways of Providence! For what great and mysterious purpose has it pleased heaven to abase the man once so elevated, and raise up him who was so abased? Dante's whole attention was riveted on a man who could thus forget his own misfortunes while occupying himself with the destinies of others. Yes, yes, continued he. 'Twill be the same as it was in England, after Charles I, Cromwell, after Cromwell, Charles II, and then James II, and then some son-in-law or relation, some Prince of Orange, a stadtholder who becomes a king. Then new concessions to the people, then a constitution, then liberty. Ah, my friend, said the abbé, turning towards Dantès, and surveying him with the kindling gaze of a prophet. You are young, you will see all this come to pass. Probably, if ever I get out of prison. True, replied Faria. We are prisoners. But I forget this sometimes, and there are even moments when my mental vision transports me beyond these walls, and I fancy myself at liberty. But wherefore are you here? Because in 1807 I dreamed of the very plan Napoleon tried to realize in 1811. Because, like Machiavelli, I desired to alter the political face of Italy, and instead of allowing it to be split up into a quantity of petty principalities, each held by some weak or tyrannical ruler, I sought to form one large, compact, and powerful empire. And lastly, because I fancied I had found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned simpleton, who feigned to enter into my views only to betray me. It was the plan of Alexander VI and Clement VII. But it will never succeed now, for they attempted it fruitlessly, and Napoleon was unable to complete his work. Italy seems fated to misfortune. And the old man bowed his head. Dantès could not understand a man risking his life for such matters. Napoleon certainly he knew something of, inasmuch as he had seen and spoken with him. But of Clement VII and Alexander VI, he knew nothing. Are you not, he asked, the priest who here in the Château d'If is generally thought to be ill? Mad? You mean, don't you? I did not like to say so, answered Dantès, smiling. Well then, resumed Faria with a bitter smile, let me answer your question in full, by acknowledging that I am the poor mad prisoner of the Château d'If, for many years permitted to amuse the different visitors with what is said to be my insanity, and in all probability, I should be promoted to the honor of making sport for the children, if such innocent beings could be found in an abode devoted like this to suffering and despair. Dantès remained for a short time mute and motionless. At length he said, Then you abandon all hope of escape? I perceive its utter impossibility, and I consider it impious to attempt that which the Almighty evidently does not approve. Nay, be not discouraged. Would it not be expecting too much to hope to succeed at your first attempt? Why not try to find an opening in another direction from that which has so unfortunately failed? Alas, it shows how little notion you can have of all it has cost me to effect a purpose so unexpectedly frustrated, that you talk of beginning over again. In the first place, I was 4 years making the tools I possess, and have been 2 years scraping and digging out earth hard as granite itself. Then what toil and fatigue has it not been to remove huge stones I should once have deemed impossible to loosen? Whole days have I passed in these titanic efforts, considering my labor well repaid if, by night time I had contrived to carry away a square inch of this hard-bound cement, changed by ages into a substance unyielding as the stones themselves. Then to conceal the mass of earth and rubbish I dug up, I was compelled to break through a staircase and throw the fruits of my labor into the hollow part of it. But the well is now so completely choked up that I scarcely think it would be possible to add another handful of dust without leading to discovery. Consider also that I fully believed I had accomplished the end and aim of my undertaking, for which I had so exactly husbanded my strength as to make it just hold out to the termination of my enterprise. And now, at the moment when I reckoned upon success, my hopes are forever dashed from me. No, I repeat again, that nothing shall induce me to renew attempts evidently at variance with the Almighty's pleasure. Dantès held down his head, that the other might not see how joy at the thought of having a companion outweighed the sympathy he felt for the failure of the abbé's plans. The abbé sank upon Edmond's bed, while Edmond himself remained standing. Escape had never once occurred to him. There are, indeed, some things which appear so impossible that the mind does not dwell on them for an instant. To undermine the ground for 50 feet, to devote 3 years to a labor which, if successful, would conduct you to a precipice overhanging the sea, to plunge into the waves from the height of 50, 60, perhaps 100 feet, at the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rocks, should you have been fortunate enough to have escaped the fire of the sentinels. And even, supposing all these perils passed, then to have to swim for your life a distance of at least 3 miles ere you could reach the shore, were difficulties so startling and formidable that Dantès had never even dreamed of such a scheme, resigning himself rather to death. But the sight of an old man clinging to life with so desperate a courage gave a fresh turn to his ideas and inspired him with new courage. Another, older and less strong than he, had attempted what he had not had sufficient resolution to undertake, and had failed only because of an error in calculation. This same person, with almost incredible patience and perseverance, had contrived to provide himself with tools requisite for so unparalleled an attempt. Another had done all this. Why, then, was it impossible to Dantès? Faria had dug his way through 50 feet. Dantès would dig 100. Faria, at the age of 50, had devoted 3 years to the task. He, who was but half as old, would sacrifice 6. Faria, a priest and savant, had not shrunk from the idea of risking his life by trying to swim a distance of 3 miles to one of the islands, Dom, Ratano, or La Mer. Should a hardy sailor, an experienced diver, like himself, shrink from a similar task? Should he, who had so often, for mere amusement's sake, plunged to the bottom of the sea to fetch up the bright coral branch, hesitate to entertain the same project? He could do it in an hour, and how many times had he, for pure pastime, continued in the water for more than twice as long? At once Dantès resolved to follow the brave example of his energetic companion, and to remember that what has once been done may be done again. After continuing some time in profound meditation, the young man suddenly exclaimed, "I have found what you were in search of." Faria started. "Have you indeed?" cried he, raising his head with quick anxiety. "Pray, let me know what it is you have discovered." "The corridor through which you have bored your way from the cell you occupy here extends in the same direction as the outer gallery, does it not?" 0207 it does. "And is not above 15 feet from it?" "About that." "Well, then, I will tell you what we must do. We must pierce through the corridor by forming a side opening about the middle, as it were the top part of a cross. This time you will lay your plans more accurately. We shall get out into the gallery you have described, kill the sentinel who guards it, and make our escape. All we require to ensure success is courage, and that you possess, and strength, which I am not deficient in. As for patience, you have abundantly proved yours. You shall now see me prove mine." "One instant, my dear friend," replied the abbé. "It is clear you do not understand the nature of the courage with which I am endowed, and what use I intend making of my strength. As for patience, I consider that I have abundantly exercised that in beginning every morning the task of the night before, and every night renewing the task of the day. But then, young man, and I pray of you to give me your full attention, then I thought I could not be doing anything displeasing to the Almighty in trying to set an innocent being at liberty, one who had committed no offense and merited not condemnation." "And have your notions changed?" asked Dantès with much surprise. "Do you think yourself more guilty in making the attempt since you have encountered me?" "No, neither do I wish to incur guilt. Hitherto I have fancied myself merely waging war against circumstances, not men. I have thought it no sin to bore through a wall, or destroy a staircase. But I cannot so easily persuade myself to pierce a heart or take away a life. A slight movement of surprise escaped Dantès. "Is it possible," said he, "that where your liberty is at stake you can allow any such scruple to deter you from obtaining it?" "Tell me," replied Faria, "what has hindered you from knocking down your jailer with a piece of wood torn from your bedstead, dressing yourself in his clothes, and endeavoring to escape?" "Simply the fact that the idea never occurred to me," answered Dantès. "Because," said the old man, "the natural repugnance to the commission of such a crime prevented you from thinking of it. And so it ever is, because in simple and allowable things our natural instincts keep us from deviating from the strict line of duty. The tiger, whose nature teaches him to delight in shedding blood, needs but the sense of smell to show him when his prey is within his reach, and by following this instinct he is enabled to measure the leap necessary to permit him to spring on his victim. But man, on the contrary, loathes the idea of blood. It is not alone that the laws of social life inspire him with a shrinking dread of taking life. His natural construction and physiological formation." Dantès was confused and silent at this explanation of the thoughts which had unconsciously been working in his mind, or rather soul. For there are two distinct sorts of ideas, those that proceed from the head and those that emanate from the heart. 0209 Since my imprisonment, said Faria, I have thought over all the most celebrated cases of escape on record. They have rarely been successful. Those that have been crowned with full success have been long meditated upon and carefully arranged. Such, for instance, as the escape of the Duc de Beaufort from the Château de Vincennes, that of the Abbé du Bucquoy from for l'Évêque, of Latude from the Bastille. Then there are those for which chance sometimes affords opportunity, and those are the best of all. Let us, therefore, wait patiently for some favorable moment, and when it presents itself, profit by it. Ah, said Dantès, you might well endure the tedious delay. You were constantly employed in the task you set yourself, and when weary with toil, you had your hopes to refresh and encourage you. I assure you, replied the old man, I did not turn to that source for recreation or support. What did you do then? I wrote or studied. Were you then permitted the use of pens, ink, and paper? Oh, no, answered the abbé. I had none but what I made for myself. You made paper, pens, and ink? Yes. Dantès gazed with admiration, but he had some difficulty in believing. Faria saw this. When you pay me a visit in my cell, my young friend, said he, I will show you an entire work, the fruits of the thoughts and reflections of my whole life, many of them meditated over in the shades of the Colosseum at Rome, at the foot of St. Mark's Column at Venice, and on the borders of the Arno at Florence, little imagining at the time that they would be arranged in order within the walls of the Château d'If. The work I speak of is called A Treatise on the Possibility of a General Monarchy in Italy, and will make one large quarto volume. And on what have you written all this? On 2 of my shirts. I invented a preparation that makes linen as smooth and as easy to write on as parchment. You are, then, a chemist? Somewhat. I know Lavoisier, and was the intimate friend of Cabanis. But for such a work you must have needed books, had you any? I had nearly 5,000 volumes in my library at Rome, but after reading them over many times, I found out that with 150 well-chosen books a man possesses, if not a complete summary of all human knowledge, at least all that a man need really know. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and studying these 150 volumes, till I knew them nearly by heart. So that since I have been in prison, a very slight effort of memory has enabled me to recall their contents as readily as though the pages were open before me. I could recite you the whole of Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Titus Livius, Tacitus, Strata, Jornans, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Bossuet. I name only the most important. You are, doubtless, acquainted with a variety of languages, so as to have been able to read all these? Yes, I speak 5 of the modern tongues, that is to say, German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. By the aid of ancient Greek I learned modern Greek. I don't speak it so well as I could wish, but I am still trying to improve myself. Improve yourself, repeated Dantès. Why, how can you manage to do so? Why, I made a vocabulary of the words I knew, turned, returned, and arranged them, so as to enable me to express my thoughts through their medium. I know nearly 1,000 words, which is all that is absolutely necessary, although I believe there are nearly 100,000 in the dictionaries. I cannot hope to be very fluent, but I certainly should have no difficulty in explaining my wants and wishes, and that would be quite as much as I should ever require. Stronger grew the wonder of Dantès, who almost fancied he had to do with one gifted with supernatural powers. Still hoping to find some imperfection which might bring him down to a level with human beings, he added, "Then if you were not furnished with pens, how did you manage to write the work you speak of?" "I made myself some excellent ones, which would be universally preferred to all others if once known. You are aware what huge whitings are served to us on maigre days. Well, I selected the cartilages of the heads of these fishes, and you can scarcely imagine the delight with which I welcomed the arrival of each Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, as affording me the means of increasing my stock of pens. For I will freely confess that my historical labors have been my greatest solace and relief. While retracing the past, I forget the present, and traversing at will the path of history, I cease to remember that I am myself a prisoner." "But the ink," said Dantès. "Of what did you make your ink?" "There was formerly a fireplace in my dungeon," replied Faria, "but it was closed up long ere I became an occupant of this prison. Still, it must have been many years in use, for it was thickly covered with a coating of soot. This soot I dissolved in a portion of the wine brought to me every Sunday, and I assure you a better ink cannot be desired. For very important notes, for which closer attention is required, I pricked one of my fingers and wrote with my own blood." "And when?" asked Dantès. "May I see all this?" "Whenever you please," replied the abbé. "Oh, then let it be directly," exclaimed the young man. "Follow me, then," said the abbé, as he re-entered the subterranean passage, in which he soon disappeared, followed by Dantès. Chapter 17. The abbé's chamber, after having passed with tolerable ease through the subterranean passage, which, however, did not admit of their holding themselves erect, the two friends reached the further end of the corridor, into which the abbé's cell opened. From that point the passage became much narrower, and barely permitted one to creep through on hands and knees. The floor of the abbé's cell was paved, and it had been by raising one of the stones in the most obscure corner that Faria had been able to commence the laborious task of which Dantès had witnessed the completion as he entered the chamber of his friend. Dantès cast around one eager and searching glance in quest of the expected marvels, but nothing more than common met his view. "It is well," said the abbé. "We have some hours before us. It is now just 12:15 o'clock. Instinctively Dantès turned round to observe by what watch or clock the abbé had been able so accurately to specify the hour. "Look at this ray of light which enters by my window," said the abbé, "and then observe the lines traced on the wall. Well, by means of these lines, which are in accordance with the double motion of the earth, and the ellipse it describes round the sun, I am enabled to ascertain the precise hour with more minuteness than if I possessed a watch, for that might be broken or deranged in its movements, while the sun and earth never vary in their appointed paths." This last explanation was wholly lost upon Dantès, who had always imagined, from seeing the sun rise from behind the mountains and set in the Mediterranean, that it moved, and not the earth. A double movement of the globe he inhabited, and of which he could feel nothing, appeared to him perfectly impossible. Each word that fell from his companion's lips seemed fraught with the mysteries of science, as worthy of digging out as the gold and diamonds in the mines of Guzerat and Golconda, which he could just recollect having visited during a voyage made in his earliest youth. "Come," said he to the abbé, "I am anxious to see your treasures." The abbé smiled, and, proceeding to the disused fireplace, raised, by the help of his chisel, a long stone, which had doubtless been the hearth, beneath which was a cavity of considerable depth, serving as a safe depository of the articles mentioned to Dantès. 0213 "What do you wish to see first?" asked the abbé. "Oh, your great work on the monarchy of Italy." Faria then drew forth from his hiding-place 3 or 4 rolls of linen, laid one over the other, like folds of papyrus. These rolls consisted of slips of cloth about 4 inches wide and 18 long. They were all carefully numbered and closely covered with writing, so legible that Dantès could easily read it as well as make out the sense, it being in Italian, a language he, as a Provençal, perfectly understood. "There," said he, "there is the work complete. I wrote the word finus at the end of the 68th strip about a week ago. I have torn up 2 of my shirts, and as many handkerchiefs as I was master of, to complete the precious pages. Should I ever get out of prison and find in all Italy a printer courageous enough to publish what I have composed, my literary reputation is forever secured." "I see," answered Dantès. "Now let me behold the curious pens with which you have written your work." "Look," said Faria, showing to the young man a slender stick about 6 inches long, and much resembling the size of the handle of a fine painting brush, to the end of which was tied, by a piece of thread, one of those cartilages of which the abbé had before spoken to Dantès. It was pointed and divided at the nib like an ordinary pen. Dantès examined it with intense admiration, then looked around to see the instrument with which it had been shaped so correctly into form. "Ah, yes," said Faria. "The penknife, that's my masterpiece. I made it, as well as this larger knife, out of an old iron candlestick." The penknife was sharp and keen as a razor. As for the other knife, it would serve a double purpose, and with it one could cut and thrust. Dantès examined the various articles shown to him with the same attention that he had bestowed on the curiosities and strange tools exhibited in the shops at Marseilles as the works of the savages in the South Seas from whence they had been brought by the different trading vessels. "As for the ink," said Faria, "I told you how I managed to obtain that, and I only just make it from time to time, as I require it." "One thing still puzzles me," observed Dantès, "and that is how you managed to do all this by daylight." "I worked at night also," replied Faria. "Night? Why, for heaven's sake, are your eyes like cats, that you can see to work in the dark? Indeed they are not. But God has supplied man with the intelligence that enables him to overcome the limitations of natural conditions. I furnished myself with a light." "You did? Pray tell me how." "I separated the fat from the meat served to me, melted it, and so made oil. Here is my lamp." So saying, the abbé exhibited a sort of torch very similar to those used in public illuminations. "But how do you procure a light?" "Oh, here are 2 flints and a piece of burnt linen. And matches." "I pretended that I had a disorder of the skin, and asked for a little sulphur, which was readily supplied." Dantès laid the different things he had been looking at on the table, and stood with his head drooping on his breast, as though overwhelmed by the perseverance and strength of Faria's mind. 0215 "You have not seen all yet," continued Faria, "for I did not think it wise to trust all my treasures in the same hiding place. Let us shut this one up." They put the stone back in its place. The abbé sprinkled a little dust over it to conceal the traces of its having been removed, rubbed his foot well on it to make it assume the same appearance as the other, and then, going towards his bed, he removed it from the spot it stood in. Behind the head of the bed, and concealed by a stone fitting in so closely as to defy all suspicion, was a hollow space, and in this space a ladder of cords between 25 and 30 feet in length. Dantès closely and eagerly examined it. He found it firm, solid, and compact enough to bear any weight. "Who supplied you with the materials for making this wonderful work?" "I tore up several of my shirts, and ripped out the seams in the sheets of my bed, during my 3 years' imprisonment at Fenestrelle, and when I was removed to the Château d'If, I managed to bring the Revelings with me, so that I have been able to finish my work here." "And was it not discovered that your sheets were unhemmed?" "Oh, no, for when I had taken out the thread I required, I hemmed the edges over again." "With what?" "With this needle," said the abbé, as, opening his ragged vestments, he showed Dantès a long, sharp fishbone, with a small perforated eye for the thread, a small portion of which still remained in it. "I once thought," continued Faria, "of removing these iron bars and letting myself down from the window, which, as you see, is somewhat wider than yours, although I should have enlarged it still more preparatory to my flight. However, I discovered that I should merely have dropped into a sort of inner court, and I therefore renounced the project altogether as too full of risk and danger. Nevertheless, I carefully preserved my ladder against one of those unforeseen opportunities of which I spoke just now, and which sudden chance frequently brings about." While affecting to be deeply engaged in examining the ladder, the mind of Dantès was, in fact, busily occupied by the idea that a person so intelligent, ingenious, and clear-sighted as the abbé might probably be able to solve the dark mystery of his own misfortunes, where he himself could see nothing. "What are you thinking of?" asked the abbé smilingly, imputing the deep abstraction in which his visitor was plunged to the excess of his awe and wonder. I was reflecting, in the first place, replied Dantès, upon the enormous degree of intelligence and ability you must have employed to reach the high perfection to which you have attained. What would you not have accomplished if you had been free? Possibly nothing at all. The overflow of my brain would probably, in a state of freedom, have evaporated in 1,000 follies. Misfortune is needed to bring to light the treasures of the human intellect. Compression is needed to explode gunpowder. Captivity has brought my mental faculties to a focus, and you are well aware that from the collision of clouds electricity is produced. From electricity, lightning, from lightning, illumination. No, replied Dantès. I know nothing. Some of your words are to me quite empty of meaning. You must be blessed indeed to possess the knowledge you have. The abbé smiled. Well, said he, but you had another subject for your thoughts. Did you not say so just now? I did. You have told me as yet but one of them. Let me hear the other. It was this, that while you had related to me all the particulars of your past life, you were perfectly unacquainted with mine. Your life, my young friend, has not been of sufficient length to admit of your having passed through any very important events. It has been long enough to inflict on me a great and undeserved misfortune. I would fain fix the source of it on man, that I may no longer vent reproaches upon heaven. Then you profess ignorance of the crime with which you are charged? I do indeed, and this I swear by the two beings most dear to me upon earth, my father and Mercédès. Come, said the abbé, closing his hiding place, and pushing the bed back to its original situation. Let me hear your story. Dantès obeyed and commenced what he called his history, but which consisted only of the account of a voyage to India and 2 or 3 voyages to the Levant, until he arrived at the recital of his last cruise, with the death of Captain Leclerc, and the receipt of a packet to be delivered by himself to the Grand Marshal. His interview with that personage and his receiving, in place of the packet, brought a letter addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier, his arrival at Marseilles and interview with his father, his affection for Mercédès and their nuptial feast, his arrest and subsequent examination, his temporary detention at the Palais de Justice, and his final imprisonment in the Château d'If. From this point everything was a blank to Dantès. He knew nothing more, not even the length of time he had been imprisoned. His recital finished, the abbé reflected long and earnestly. There is, said he at the end of his meditations, a clever maxim which bears upon what I was saying to you some little while ago, and that is that unless wicked ideas take root in a naturally depraved mind, human nature, in a right and wholesome state, revolts at crime. Still, from an artificial civilization have originated wants, vices, and false tastes, which occasionally become so powerful as to stifle within us all good feelings, and ultimately to lead us into guilt and wickedness. From this view of things, then, comes the axiom that if you visit to discover the author of any bad action, seek first to discover the person to whom the perpetration of that bad action could be in any way advantageous. Now, to apply it in your case, to whom could your disappearance have been serviceable? To no one, by heaven. I was a very insignificant person. Do not speak thus, for your reply evinces neither logic nor philosophy. Everything is relative, my dear young friend, from the king who stands in the way of his successor, to the employee who keeps his rival out of a place. Now, in the event of the king's death, his successor inherits a crown. When the employee dies, the supernumerary steps into his shoes and receives his salary of 12,000 livres. Well, these 12,000 livres are his civil list, and are as essential to him as the 12 millions of a king. Everyone, from the highest to the lowest degree, has his place on the social ladder, and is beset by stormy passions and conflicting interests, as in Descartes' theory of pressure and impulsion. But these forces increase as we go higher, so that we have a spiral which in defiance of reason rests upon the apex and not on the base. Now let us return to your particular world. You say you were on the point of being made captain of the Pharaon. Yes. And about to become the husband of a young and lovely girl? Yes. Now, could anyone have had any interest in preventing the accomplishment of these two things? But let us first settle the question as to its being the interest of anyone to hinder you from being captain of the Pharaon. What say you? I cannot believe such was the case. I was generally liked on board, and had the sailors possessed the right of selecting a captain themselves, I feel convinced their choice would have fallen on me. There was only one person among the crew who had any feeling of ill will towards me. I had quarrelled with him some time previously, and had even challenged him to fight me, but he refused. Now we are getting on. And what was this man's name? Danglars. What rank did he hold on board? He was supercargo. And had you been captain, should you have retained him in his employment? Not if the choice had remained with me, for I had frequently observed inaccuracies in his accounts. Good again. Now then, tell me, was any person present during your last conversation with Captain Leclerc? No, we were quite alone. Could your conversation have been overheard by anyone? It might, for the cabin door was open, and stay, now I recollect, Danglars himself passed by just as Captain Leclerc was giving me the packet for the Grand Marshal. That's better, cried the abbé. Now we are on the right scent. Did you take anybody with you when you put into the port of Elba? Nobody. Somebody there received your packet and gave you a letter in place of it, I think? Yes, the Grand Marshal did. And what did you do with that letter? Put it into my portfolio. You had your portfolio with you, then? Now, how could a sailor find room in his pocket for a portfolio large enough to contain an official letter? You are right. It was left on board. Then it was not till your return to the ship that you put the letter in the portfolio? No. And what did you do with this same letter while returning from Porto Ferrajo to the vessel? I carried it in my hand, so that when you went on board the Pharaon, everybody could see that you held a letter in your hand? Yes. Danglars as well as the rest? Danglars as well as others. Now listen to me and try to recall every circumstance attending your arrest. Do you recollect the words in which the information against you was formulated? Oh yes, I read it over 3 times, and the words sank deeply into my memory. Repeat it to me. Dantès paused a moment, then said, This is it, word for word. The king's attorney is informed by a friend to the throne and religion that one Edmond Dantès, made on board the Pharaon, this day arrived from Smyrna, after having touched at Naples and Porto Ferrajo, has been entrusted by Murat with a packet for the usurper. Again, by the usurper with a letter for the Bonapartist Club in Paris. This proof of his guilt may be procured by his immediate arrest, as the letter will be found either about his person, at his father's residence, or in his cabin on board the Pharaon. The abbé shrugged his shoulders. The thing is clear as day, said he, and you must have had a very confiding nature as well as a good heart not to have suspected the origin of the whole affair. Do you really think so? Ah, that would indeed be infamous. How did Danglars usually write? In a handsome, running hand. And how was the anonymous letter written? Backhanded. Again the abbé smiled. Disguised. It was very boldly written, if disguised. Stop a bit, said the abbé, taking up what he called his pen, and after dipping it into the ink, he wrote on a piece of prepared linen with his left hand the first 2 or 3 words of the accusation. Dantès drew back and gazed on the abbé with a sensation almost amounting to terror. How very astonishing, cried he at length. Why, your writing exactly resembles that of the accusation. Simply because that accusation had been written with the left hand, and I have noticed that, that while the writing of different persons done with the right hand varies, that performed with the left hand is invariably uniform. You have evidently seen and observed everything. Let us proceed. Oh, yes, yes. Now, as regards the second question. I am listening. Was there any person whose interest it was to prevent your marriage with Mercédès? Yes, a young man who loved her. And his name was Fernand. That is a Spanish name, I think? He was a Catalan. You imagine him capable of writing the letter? Oh, no. He would more likely have got rid of me by sticking a knife into me. That is in strict accordance with the Spanish character. An assassination they will unhesitatingly commit, but an act of cowardice, never. Besides, said Dantès, the various circumstances mentioned in the letter were wholly unknown to him. You had never spoken of them yourself to anyone? To no one? Not even to your mistress? No, not even to my betrothed. Then it is Danglars. I feel quite sure of it now. Wait a little, pray. Was Danglars acquainted with Fernand? No, yes, he was. Now I recollect. What? To have seen them both sitting at table together under an arbor at Père Pamphil's the evening before the day fixed for my wedding. They were in earnest conversation. Danglars was joking in a friendly way, but Fernand looked pale and agitated. Were they alone? There was a third person with them whom I knew perfectly well and who had, in all probability, made their acquaintance. He was a tailor named Cataris, but he was very drunk. Stay! Stay! How strange that it should not have occurred to me before. Now I remember quite well that on the table round which they were sitting were pens, ink, and paper. Oh, the heartless, treacherous scoundrels! Exclaimed Dantès, pressing his hand to his throbbing brows. Is there anything else I can assist you in discovering besides the villainy of your friends? Inquired the abbé with a laugh. Yes, yes, replied Dantès eagerly. I would beg of you, who see so completely to the depths of things, and to whom the greatest mystery seems but an easy riddle, to explain to me how it was that I underwent no second examination, was never brought to trial, and, above all, was condemned without ever having had sentence passed on me. That is altogether a different and more serious matter, responded the abbé. The ways of justice are frequently too dark and mysterious to be easily penetrated. All we have hitherto done in the matter has been child's play. If you wish me to enter upon the more difficult part of the business, you must assist me by the most minute information on every point. Pray ask me whatever questions you please. For, in good truth, you see more clearly into my life than I do myself. In the first place, then, who examined you? The king's attorney, his deputy, or a magistrate? The deputy. Was he young or old? About 6 or 27 years of age, I should say. So, answered the abbé. Old enough to be ambitious, but too young to be corrupt. And how did he treat you? With more of mildness than severity. Did you tell him your whole story? I did. And did his conduct change at all in the course of your examination? He did appear much disturbed when he read the letter that had brought me into this scrape. He seemed quite overcome by my misfortune. By your misfortune? Yes. Then you feel quite sure that it was your misfortune he deplored? He gave me one great proof of his sympathy at any rate. And that? He burnt the sole evidence that could at all have criminated me. What? The accusation? No, the letter. Are you sure? I saw it done. That alters the case. This man might, after all, be a greater scoundrel than you have thought possible. Upon my word, said Dantès. You make me shudder. Is the world filled with tigers and crocodiles? Yes. And remember that two-legged tigers and crocodiles are more dangerous than the others. Never mind. Let us go on. With all my heart. You tell me he burned the letter. He did, saying at the same time, You see, I thus destroy the only proof existing against you. This action is somewhat too sublime to be natural. You think so? I am sure of it. To whom was this letter addressed? To M. Noirtier, Rue Coquerin, number 13, Paris. Now can you conceive of any interest that your heroic deputy could possibly have had in the destruction of that letter? Why, it is not altogether impossible he might have had, for he made me promise several times never to speak of that letter to anyone, assuring me he so advised me for my own interest. And, more than this, he insisted on my taking a solemn oath never to utter the name mentioned in the address. Noirtier, repeated the abbé. Noirtier. I knew a person of that name at the court of the Queen of Etruria, a Noirtier who had been a Girondin during the Revolution. What was your deputy called? De Villefort. The abbé burst into a fit of laughter, while Dantès gazed on him in utter astonishment. What ails you? Said he at length. Do you see that ray of sunlight? I do. Well, the whole thing is more clear to me than that sunbeam is to you. Poor fellow. Poor young man. And you tell me this magistrate expressed great sympathy and commiseration for you. He did. And the worthy man destroyed your compromising letter? Yes. And then made you swear never to utter the name of Noirtier? Yes. Why, you poor short-sighted simpleton. Can you not guess who this Noirtier was? whose very name he was so careful to keep concealed. This noirtier was his father. Had a thunderbolt fallen at the feet of Dantès, or hell opened its yawning gulf before him, he could not have been more completely transfixed with horror than he was at the sound of these unexpected words. Starting up, he clasped his hands around his head as though to prevent his very brain from bursting, and exclaimed, "His father! His father!" "Yes, his father," replied the abbé. His right name was Noirtier de Villefort. At this instant a bright light shot through the mind of Dantès, and cleared up all that had been dark and obscure before. The change that had come over Villefort during the examination, the destruction of the letter, the exacted promise, the almost supplicating tones of the magistrate, who seemed rather to implore mercy than to pronounce punishment, all returned with a stunning force to his memory. He cried out and staggered against the wall like a drunken man. Then he hurried to the opening that led from the abbé's cell to his own, and said, "I must be alone to think over all this." When he regained his dungeon, he threw himself on his bed, where the turnkey found him in the evening visit, sitting with fixed gaze and contracted features, dumb and motionless as a statue. During these hours of profound meditation, which to him had seemed only minutes, he had formed a fearful resolution, and bound himself to its fulfillment by a solemn oath. Dantès was at length roused from his reverie by the voice of Faria, who, having also been visited by his jailer, had come to invite his fellow-sufferer to share his supper. The reputation of being out of his mind, though harmlessly and even amusingly so, had procured for the abbé unusual privileges. He was supplied with bread of a finer, whiter quality than the usual prison fare, and even regaled each Sunday with a small quantity of wine. Now this was a Sunday, and the abbé had come to ask his young companion to share the luxuries with him. Dantès followed him. His features were no longer contracted, and now wore their usual expression, but there was that in his whole appearance that bespoke one who had come to a fixed and desperate resolve. Faria bent on him his penetrating eye. "I regret now," said he, "having helped you in your late inquiries, or having given you the information I did." "Why so?" inquired Dantès. "Because it has instilled a new passion in your heart, that of vengeance." Dantès smiled. "Let us talk of something else," said he. Again the abbé looked at him, then mournfully shook his head. But in accordance with Dantès' request, he began to speak of other matters. The elder prisoner was one of those persons whose conversation, like that of all who have experienced many trials, contained many useful and important hints as well as sound information. But it was never egotistical, for the unfortunate man never alluded to his own sorrows. Dantès listened with admiring attention to all he said. Some of his remarks corresponded with what he already knew, or applied to the sort of knowledge his nautical life had enabled him to acquire. A part of the good abbé's words, however, were wholly incomprehensible to him, but, like the aurora which guides the navigator in northern latitudes, opened new vistas to the inquiring mind of the listener, and gave fantastic glimpses of new horizons, enabling him justly to estimate the delight an intellectual mind would have in following one so richly gifted as Faria along the heights of truth, where he was so much at home. "You must teach me a small part of what you know," said Dantès, "if only to prevent your growing weary of me. I can well believe that so learned a person as yourself would prefer absolute solitude to being tormented with the company of one as ignorant and uninformed as myself. If you will only agree to my request, I promise you never to mention another word about escaping." The abbé smiled. "Alas, my boy," said he, "human knowledge is confined within very narrow limits, and when I have taught you mathematics, physics, history, and the 3 or 4 modern languages with which I am acquainted, you will know as much as I do myself. Now, it will scarcely require 2 years for me to communicate to you the stock of learning I possess." "2 years!" exclaimed Dantès. "Do you really believe I can acquire all these things in so short a time? Not their application, certainly, but their principles you may. To learn is not to know. There are the learners and the learned. Memory makes the one, philosophy the other. But cannot one learn philosophy? Philosophy cannot be taught. It is the application of the sciences to truth. It is like the golden cloud in which the Messiah went up into heaven." "Well, then," said Dantès, "what shall you teach me first? I am in a hurry to begin. I want to learn." "Everything," said the abbé. And that very evening the prisoners sketched a plan of education, to be entered upon the following day. Dantès possessed a prodigious memory, combined with an astonishing quickness and readiness of conception. The mathematical turn of his mind rendered him apt at all kinds of calculation, while his naturally poetical feelings threw a light and pleasing veil over the dry reality of arithmetical computation, or the rigid severity of geometry. He already knew Italian, and had also picked up a little of the Romaic dialect during voyages to the East, and by the aid of these two languages he easily comprehended the construction of all the others, so that at the end of 6 months he began to speak Spanish, English, and German in strict accordance with the promise made to the abbé. Dantès spoke no more of escape. Perhaps the delight his studies afforded him left no room for such thoughts. Perhaps the recollection that he had pledged his word, on which his sense of honor was keen, kept him from referring in any way to the possibilities of flight. Days, even months, passed by unheeded in one rapid and instructive course. At the end of a year Dantès was a new man. Dantès observed, however, that Faria, in spite of the relief his society afforded, daily grew sadder. One thought seemed incessantly to harass and distract his mind. Sometimes he would fall into long reveries, sigh heavily and involuntarily, then suddenly rise, and, with folded arms, begin pacing the confined space of his dungeon. One day he stopped all at once, and exclaimed, "Ah, if there were no sentinel!" "There shall not be one a minute longer than you please," said Dantès, who had followed the working of his thoughts as accurately as though his brain were enclosed in crystal so clear as to display its minutest operations. "I have already told you," answered the abbé, "that I loathe the idea of shedding blood. And yet the murder, if you choose to call it so, would be simply a measure of self-preservation. No matter, I could never agree to it." "Still, you have thought of it?" "Incessantly, alas!" cried the abbé. "And you have discovered a means of regaining our freedom, have you not?" asked Dantès eagerly. "I have, if it were only possible to place a deaf and blind sentinel in the gallery beyond us." "He shall be both blind and deaf," replied the young man, with an air of determination that made his companion shudder. "No, no," cried the abbé. "Impossible!" Dantès endeavored to renew the subject. The abbé shook his head in token of disapproval, and refused to make any further response. 3 months passed away. "Are you strong?" the abbé asked one day of Dantès. The young man, in reply, took up the chisel, bent it into the form of a horseshoe, and then as readily straightened it. "And will you engage not to do any harm to the sentry, except as a last resort?" "I promise on my honor." "Then," said the abbé, "we may hope to put our design into execution. And how long shall we be in accomplishing the necessary work?" "At least a year." "And shall we begin at once?" "At once." "We have lost a year to no purpose," cried Dantès. "Do you consider the last 12 months to have been wasted?" asked the abbé. "Forgive me," cried Edmond, blushing deeply. "Tut, tut," answered the abbé. "Man is but man after all, and you are about the best specimen of the genus I have ever known. Come, let me show you my plan." The abbé then showed Dantès the sketch he had made for their escape. It consisted of a plan of his own cell and that of Dantès, with the passage which united them. In this passage he proposed to drive a level as they do in mines. This level would bring the 2 prisoners immediately beneath the gallery where the sentry kept watch. Once there, a large excavation would be made, and one of the flagstones with which the gallery was paved be so completely loosened that at the desired moment it would give way beneath the feet of the soldier, who, stunned by his fall, would be immediately bound and gagged by Dantès before he had power to offer any resistance. The prisoners were then to make their way through one of the gallery windows, and to let themselves down from the outer walls by means of the abbé's ladder of cords. Dantès' eyes sparkled with joy, and he rubbed his hands with delight at the idea of a plan so simple, yet apparently so certain to succeed. That very day the miners began their labors, with a vigor and alacrity proportionate to their long rest from fatigue and their hopes of ultimate success. Nothing interrupted the progress of the work except the necessity that each was under of returning to his cell in anticipation of the turnkey's visits. They had learned to distinguish the almost imperceptible sound of his footsteps as he descended towards their dungeons, and happily, never failed of being prepared for his coming. The fresh earth excavated during their present work, and which would have entirely blocked up the old passage, was thrown, by degrees and with the utmost precaution, out of the window in either Faria's or Dantès' cell, the rubbish being first pulverized so finely that the night wind carried it far away without permitting the smallest trace to remain. More than a year had been consumed in this undertaking, the only tools for which had been a chisel, a knife, and a wooden lever. Faria still, continuing to instruct Dantès by conversing with him, sometimes in one language, sometimes in another. At others, relating to him the history of nations and great men who from time to time have risen to fame and trodden the path of glory. The abbé was a man of the world, and had, moreover, mixed in the first society of the day. He wore an air of melancholy dignity which Dantès, thanks to the imitative powers bestowed on him by nature, easily acquired, as well as that outward polish and politeness he had before been wanting in, and which is seldom possessed except by those who have been placed in constant intercourse with persons of high birth and breeding. At the end of 15 months the level was finished, and the excavation completed beneath the gallery, and the two workmen could distinctly hear the measured tread of the sentinel as he paced to and fro over their heads. Compelled, as they were, to await a night sufficiently dark to favor their flight, they were obliged to defer their final attempt till that auspicious moment should arrive. Their greatest dread now was lest the stone through which the sentry was doomed to fall should give way before its right time, and this they had in some measure provided against by propping it up with a small beam which they had discovered in the walls through which they had worked their way. Dantès was occupied in arranging this piece of wood when he heard Faria, who had remained in Edmond's cell for the purpose of cutting a peg to secure their rope ladder, call to him in a tone indicative of great suffering. Dantès hastened to his dungeon, where he found him standing in the middle of the room, pale as death, his forehead streaming with perspiration, and his hands clenched tightly together. "Gracious heavens!" exclaimed Dantès. "What is the matter? What has happened?" "Quick, quick!" returned the abbé. "Listen to what I have to say." Dantès looked in fear and wonder at the livid countenance of Faria, whose eyes, already dull and sunken, were surrounded by purple circles, while his lips were white as those of a corpse, and his very hair seemed to stand on end. "Tell me, I beseech you, what ails you?" cried Dantès, letting his chisel fall to the floor. "Alas," faltered out the abbé, "all is over with me. I am seized with a terrible, perhaps mortal illness. I can feel that the paroxysm is fast approaching. I had a similar attack the year previous to my imprisonment. This malady admits but of one remedy. I will tell you what that is. Go into my cell as quickly as you can. Draw out one of the feet that support the bed." Chapter 18. The treasure. When Dantès returned next morning to the chamber of his companion in captivity, he found Faria seated and looking composed. In the ray of light which entered by the narrow window of his cell, he held open in his left hand, of which alone, it will be recollected, he retained the use, a sheet of paper, which, from being constantly rolled into a small compass, had the form of a cylinder, and was not easily kept open. He did not speak, but showed the paper to Dantès. "What is that?" he inquired. "Look at it," said the abbé with a smile. "I have looked at it with all possible attention," said Dantès, "and I only see a half-burnt paper on which are traces of Gothic characters inscribed with a peculiar kind of ink." "This paper, my friend," said Faria, "I may now avow to you, since I have the proof of your fidelity. This paper is my treasure, of which, from this day forth, one half belongs to you." The sweat started forth on Dantès' brow. Until this day, and for how long a time, he had refrained from talking of the treasure, which had brought upon the abbé the accusation of madness. With his instinctive delicacy, Edmond had preferred avoiding any touch on this painful chord, and Faria had been equally silent. He had taken the silence of the old man for a return to reason, and now these few words uttered by Faria, after so painful a crisis, seemed to indicate a serious relapse into mental alienation. "Your treasure?" stammered Dantès. Faria smiled. "Yes," said he. "You have, indeed, a noble nature, Edmond, and I see by your paleness and agitation what is passing in your heart at this moment. No, be assured I am not mad. This treasure exists, Dantès, and if I have not been allowed to possess it, you will. Yes, you. No one would listen or believe me because everyone thought me mad. But you, who must know that I am not, listen to me, and believe me so afterwards if you will." "Alas," murmured Edmond to himself, "this is a terrible relapse, There was only this blow wanting. Then he said aloud, "My dear friend, your attack has perhaps fatigued you. Had you not better repose a while? Tomorrow, if you will, I will hear your narrative. But today I wish to nurse you carefully. Besides," he said, "a treasure is not a thing we need hurry about. On the contrary, it is a matter of the utmost importance, Edmond," replied the old man. "Who knows if tomorrow or the next day after, the third attack may not come on, and then must not all be over? Yes, indeed, I have often thought with a bitter joy that these riches, which would make the wealth of a dozen families, will be forever lost to those men who persecute me. This idea was one of vengeance to me, and I tasted it slowly in the night of my dungeon and the despair of my captivity. But now I have forgiven the world for the love of you. Now that I see you, young and with a promising future, now that I think of all that may result to you in the good fortune of such a disclosure, I shudder at any delay, and tremble lest I should not assure to one as worthy as yourself the possession of so vast an amount of hidden wealth." Edmond turned away his head with a sigh. "You persist in your incredulity, Edmond," continued Faria. "My words have not convinced you. I see you require proofs. Well, then, read this paper, which I have never shown to anyone." "Tomorrow, my dear friend," said Edmond, desirous of not yielding to the old man's madness. "I thought it was understood that we should not talk of that until tomorrow." "Then we will not talk of it until tomorrow. But read this paper today." "I will not irritate him," thought Edmond, and taking the paper, of which half was wanting, having been burnt, no doubt, by some accident, he read, "This treasure, which may amount to 2 of Roman crowns in the most distant of the second opening double, declare to belong to him allo heir. April 25th, 149 foot. "Well," said Faria, when the young man had finished reading it. "Why," replied Dantès, "I see nothing but broken lines and unconnected words, which are rendered illegible by fire. Yes, to you, my friend, who read them for the first time, but not for me, who have grown pale over them by many nights' study, and have reconstructed every phrase, completed every thought. And do you believe you have discovered the hidden meaning? I am sure I have, and you shall judge for yourself. But first listen to the history of this paper." "Silence!" exclaimed Dantès. "Steps approach. I go adieu." And Dantès, happy to escape the history and explanation which would be sure to confirm his belief in his friend's mental instability, glided like a snake along the narrow passage, while Faria, restored by his alarm to a certain amount of activity, pushed the stone into place with his foot, and covered it with a mat in order the more effectually to avoid discovery. It was the governor, who, hearing of Faria's illness from the jailer, had come in person to see him. Faria sat up to receive him, avoiding all gestures in order that he might conceal from the governor the paralysis that had already half stricken him with death. His fear was lest the governor, touched with pity, might order him to be removed to better quarters, and thus separate him from his young companion. But fortunately this was not the case, and the governor left him, convinced that the poor madman, for whom in his heart he felt a kind of affection, was only troubled with a slight indisposition. During this time, Edmond, seated on his bed with his head in his hands, tried to collect his scattered thoughts. Faria, since their first acquaintance, had been on all points so rational and logical, so wonderfully sagacious, in fact, that he could not understand how so much wisdom on all points could be allied with madness. Was Faria deceived as to his treasure, or was all the world deceived as to Faria? Dantès remained in his cell all day, not daring to return to his friend, thinking thus to defer the moment when he should be convinced, once for all, that the abbé was mad. Such a conviction would be so terrible. But towards the evening, after the hour for the customary visit had gone by, Faria, not seeing the young man appear, tried to move and get over the distance which separated them. Edmond shuddered when he heard the painful efforts which the old man made to drag himself along. His leg was inert, and he could no longer make use of one arm. Edmond was obliged to assist him, for otherwise he would not have been able to enter by the small aperture which led to Dantès' chamber. "Here I am, pursuing you remorselessly," he said with a benignant smile. "You thought to escape my munificence, but it is in vain. Listen to me." Edmond saw there was no escape, and placing the old man on his bed, he seated himself on the stool beside him. "You know," said the abbé, that I was the secretary and intimate friend of Cardinal Spada, the last of the princes of that name. I owe to this worthy lord all the happiness I ever knew. He was not rich, although the wealth of his family had passed into a proverb, and I heard the phrase very often, as rich as a Spada. But he, like public rumor, lived on this reputation for wealth. His palace was my paradise. I was tutor to his nephews, who are dead, and when he was alone in the world, I tried by absolute devotion to his will to make up to him all he had done for me during 10 years of unremitting kindness. The cardinal's house had no secrets for me. I had often seen my noble patron annotating ancient volumes and eagerly searching amongst dusty family manuscripts. One day when I was reproaching him for his unavailing searches and deploring the prostration of mind that followed them, he looked at me and, smiling bitterly, opened a volume relating to the history of the city of Rome. There, in the 20th chapter of the life of Pope Alexander VI, were the following lines, which I can never forget. The great wars of Romagna had ended. Caesar Borgia, who had completed his conquest, had need of money to purchase all Italy. The Pope had also need of money to bring matters to an end with Louis XII, King of France, who was formidable still in spite of his recent reverses, and it was necessary, therefore, to have recourse to some profitable scheme, which was a matter of great difficulty in the impoverished condition of exhausted Italy. His Holiness had an idea. He determined to make 2 cardinals. By choosing 2 of the greatest personages of Rome, especially rich men, this was the return the Holy Father looked for. In the first place, he could sell the great appointments and splendid offices which the cardinals already held, and then he had the 2 hats to sell besides. There was a third point in view which will appear hereafter. The Pope and Caesar Borgia first found the 2 future cardinals. They were Giovanni Rospigliosi, who held 4 of the highest dignities of the Holy See, and Caesar Spada, one of the noblest and richest of the Roman nobility. Both felt the high honor of such a favor from the Pope. They were ambitious, and Caesar Borgia soon found purchasers for their appointments. The result was that Rospigliosi and Spada paid for being cardinals, and 8 other persons paid for the offices the cardinals held before their elevation, and thus 800,000 crowns entered into the coffers of the speculators. 0239 m. It is time now to proceed to the last part of the speculation. The Pope heaped attentions upon Rospigliosi and Spada, conferred upon them the insignia of the cardinalate, and induced them to arrange their affairs and take up their residence at Rome. Then the Pope and Caesar Borgia invited the 2 cardinals to dinner. This was a matter of dispute between the Holy Father and his son. Caesar thought they could make use of one of the means which he always had ready for his friends, that is to say, in the first place, the famous key which was given to certain persons with the request that they go and open a designated cupboard. This key was furnished with a small iron point, a negligence on the part of the locksmith. When this was pressed to effect the opening of the cupboard, of which the lock was difficult, the person was pricked by this small point and died next day. Then there was the ring with the lion's head, which Caesar wore when he wanted to greet his friends with a clasp of the hand. The lion bit the hand thus favored, and at the end of 24 hours the bite was mortal. Caesar proposed to his father that they should either ask the cardinals to open the cupboard or shake hands with them, but Alexander VI replied, "Now as to the worthy cardinals, Spada and Rospigliosi, let us ask both of them to dinner. Something tells me that we shall get that money back. Besides, you forget, Caesar, and indigestion declares itself immediately, while a prick or a bite occasions a delay of a day or 2. Caesar gave way before such cogent reasoning, and the cardinals were consequently invited to dinner. The table was laid in a vineyard belonging to the Pope near San Pierdarena, a charming retreat which the cardinals knew very well by report. Rospigliosi, quite set up with his new dignities, went with a good appetite and his most ingratiating manner. Spada, a prudent man and greatly attached to his only nephew, a young captain of the highest promise, took paper and pen and made his will. He then sent word to his nephew to wait for him near the vineyard, but it appeared the servant did not find him. Spada knew what these invitations meant. Since Christianity, so eminently civilizing, had made progress in Rome, it was no longer a centurion who came from the tyrant with a message, "Caesar wills that you die." But it was a legate à latir who came with a smile on his lips to say from the Pope, "His Holiness requests you to dine with him." Spada set out about 2 o'clock to San Pierdarena. The Pope awaited him. The first sight that attracted the eyes of Spada was that of his nephew, in full costume, and Caesar Borgia paying him most marked attentions. Spada turned pale as Caesar looked at him with an ironical air, which proved that he had anticipated all, and that the snare was well spread. They began dinner and Spada was only able to inquire of his nephew if he had received his message. The nephew replied no, perfectly comprehending the meaning of the question. It was too late, for he had already drunk a glass of excellent wine, placed for him expressly by the Pope's butler. Spada at the same moment saw another bottle approach him, which he was pressed to taste. An hour afterwards a physician declared they were both poisoned through eating mushrooms. Spada died on the threshold of the vineyard. The nephew expired at his own door, making signs which his wife could not comprehend. Then Caesar and the Pope hastened to lay hands on the heritage, under pretense of seeking for the papers of the dead man. But the inheritance consisted in this only, a scrap of paper on which Spada had written, "I bequeath to my beloved nephew my coffers, my books, and, amongst others, my breviary with the gold corners, which I beg he will preserve in remembrance of his affectionate uncle." The heirs sought everywhere, admired the breviary, laid hands on the furniture, and were greatly astonished that Spada, the rich man, was really the most miserable of uncles. No treasures, unless they were those of science, contained in the library and laboratories. That was all. Caesar and his father searched, examined, scrutinized, but found nothing, or at least very little, not exceeding a few thousand crowns in plate, and about the same in ready money. But the nephew had time to say to his wife before he expired, "Look well among my uncle's papers, there is a will." They sought even more thoroughly than the Auguste heirs had done, but it was fruitless. There were 2 palaces and a vineyard behind the Palatine Hill, but in these days landed property had not much value, and the 2 palaces and the vineyard remained to the family since they were beneath the rapacity of the Pope and his son. Months and years rolled on. Alexander VI died poisoned, you know by what mistake. Caesar, poisoned at the same time, escaped by shedding his skin like a snake, but the new skin was spotted by the poison till it looked like a tiger's. Then, compelled to quit Rome, he went and got himself obscurely killed in a night skirmish, scarcely noticed in history. After the Pope's death and his son's exile, it was supposed that the Spada family would resume the splendid position they had held before the cardinal's time, but this was not the case. The Spadas remained in doubtful ease, a mystery hung over this dark affair, and the public rumor was that Caesar, a better politician than his father, had carried off from the Pope the fortune of the 2 cardinals. I say the 2 because Cardinal Rospigliosi, who had not taken any precaution, was completely despoiled. "Up to this point," said Faria, interrupting the thread of his narrative, "this seems to you very meaningless, no doubt, eh?" "Oh, my friend," cried Dantès. "On the contrary, it seems as if I were reading a most interesting narrative. Go on, I beg of you." "I will." The family began to get accustomed to their obscurity. Years rolled on, and amongst the descendants some were soldiers, others diplomatists. Some churchmen, some bankers. Some grew rich and some were ruined. I come now to the last of the family, whose secretary I was, the Count of Spada. I had often heard him complain of the disproportion of his rank with his fortune, and I advised him to invest all he had in an annuity. He did so and thus doubled his income. The celebrated breviary remained in the family, and was in the Count's possession. It had been handed down from father to son, for the singular clause of the only will that had been found had caused it to be regarded as a genuine relic, preserved in the family with superstitious veneration. It was an illuminated book with beautiful Gothic characters and so weighty with gold that a servant always carried it before the cardinal on days of great solemnity. At the sight of papers of all sorts, titles, contracts, parchments, which were kept in the archives of the family, all descending from the poisoned cardinal, I in my turn examined the immense bundles of documents, like 20 servitors, stewards, secretaries before me, but in spite of the most exhaustive researches, I found nothing. Yet I had even written a precise history of the Borgia family, for the sole purpose of assuring myself whether any increase of fortune had occurred to them on the death of the Cardinal Caesar Spada, but could only trace the acquisition of the property of the Cardinal Rospigliosi, his companion in misfortune. I was then almost assured that the inheritance had neither profited the Borgias nor the family, but had remained unpossessed like the treasures of the Arabian Nights, which slept in the bosom of the earth under the eyes of the genie. I searched, ransacked, counted, calculated 1,000 times the income and expenditure of the family for 300 years. It was useless. I remained in my ignorance, and the Count of Spada in his poverty. My patron died. He had reserved from his annuity his family papers, his library, composed of 5,000 volumes, and his famous breviary. All these he bequeathed to me with 1,000 Roman crowns, which he had in ready money, on condition that I would have anniversary masses said for the repose of his soul, and that I would draw up a genealogical tree and history of his house. All this I did scrupulously. Be easy, my dear Edmond, we are near the conclusion. In 1807, a month before I was arrested, and a fortnight after the death of the Count of Spada, on the 25th of December, you will see presently how the date became fixed in my memory. I was reading, for the 1,000th time, the papers I was arranging, for the palace was sold to a stranger, and I was going to leave Rome and settle at Florence, intending to take with me 12,000 francs I possessed, my library, and the famous breviary, when, tired with my constant labor at the same thing, and overcome by a heavy dinner I had eaten, my head dropped on my hands, and I fell asleep about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 0243 m. I awoke as the clock was striking 6. I raised my head. I was in utter darkness. I rang for a light, but, as no one came, I determined to find one for myself. It was indeed but anticipating the simple manners which I should soon be under the necessity of adopting. I took a wax candle in one hand, and with the other groped about for a piece of paper, my matchbox being empty, with which I proposed to get a light from the small flame still playing on the embers. Fearing, however, to make use of any valuable piece of paper, I hesitated for a moment, then recollected that I had seen in the famous breviary, which was on the table beside me, an old paper quite yellow with age, and which had served as a marker for centuries, kept there by the request of the heirs. I felt for it, found it, twisted it up together, and putting it into the expiring flame, set light to it. But beneath my fingers, as if by magic, in proportion as the fire ascended, I saw yellowish characters appear on the paper. I grasped it in my hand, put out the flame as quickly as I could, lighted my taper in the fire itself, and opened the crumpled paper with inexpressible emotion, recognizing, when I had done so, that these characters had been traced in mysterious and sympathetic ink, only appearing when exposed to the fire. Nearly 1/3 of the paper had been consumed by the flame. It was that paper you read this morning. Read it again, Dantès, and then I will complete for you the incomplete words and unconnected sense. Faria, with an air of triumph, offered the paper to Dantès, who this time read the following words, traced with an ink of a reddish color resembling rust. This 25th day of April, 1498, b. Alexander 6, and fearing that not, he may desire to become my heir, and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, my sole heir, that I have you, and has visited with me, that is, in island of Monte Cristo, all I possess, jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone, may amount to nearly 2 mil, will find on raising the 20th arrow, creek to the east in a right line, 2 open, in these caves, the treasure is in the furthest which treasure I bequeath and leave in, as my sole heir. 25 April, 1498. Cause, and now, said the abbé, read this other paper. And he presented to Dantès a second leaf with fragments of lines written on it, which Edmond read as follows. I am invited to dine by his holiness, content with making me pay for my hat, serves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprera. I declare to my nephew Guido Spada, read in a place he knows, the caves of the small, seed of ingots, gold, money, know of the existence of this treasure, which, lions of Roman crowns, and which he, ck, from the small, ings have been made, Engel in the second, tire to him, ar Spada. Faria followed him with an excited look. And now, he said, when he saw that Dantès had read the last line, put the 2 fragments together and judge for yourself. Dantès obeyed, and the conjoint pieces gave the following. 0245 m. This 25th day of April, 1498, b. Ing invited to dine by His Holiness Alexander VI, and fearing that not, content with making me pay for my hat, he may desire to become my heir, and serves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprera and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, I declare to my nephew, Guido Spada, my sole heir, that I have buried in a place he knows and has visited with me, that is, in the caves of the small island of Monte Cristo, all I possess of ingots, gold, money, jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone know of the existence of this treasure, which may amount to nearly 2 millions of Roman crowns, and which he will find on raising the 20th arrow, CK from the small creek to the east in a right line. 2 openings have been made in these caves. The treasure is in the furthest angle in the second, which treasure I bequeath and leave entire to him as my sole heir. April 25, 1498. Cause A.R. Spada. Well, do you comprehend now? Inquired Faria. It is the declaration of Cardinal Spada, and the will so long sought for, replied Edmond, still incredulous. Yes, 1,000 times yes, and who completed it as it now is? I did. Aided by the remaining fragment, I guessed the rest. Measuring the length of the lines by those of the paper, and divining the hidden meaning by means of what was in part revealed, as we are guided in a cavern by the small ray of light above us. And what did you do when you arrived at this conclusion? I resolved to set out, and did set out at that very instant, carrying with me the beginning of my great work, the unity of the Italian kingdom. But for some time the imperial police, who at this period, quite contrary to what Napoleon desired so soon as he had a son born to him, wished for a partition of provinces, had their eyes on me, and my hasty departure, the cause of which they were unable to guess, having aroused their suspicions, I was arrested at the very moment I was leaving. Piombino. Now, continued Faria, addressing Dantès with an almost paternal expression. Now, my dear fellow, you know as much as I do myself. If we ever escape together, half this treasure is yours. If I die here, and you escape alone, the whole belongs to you. But, inquired Dantès hesitating, has this treasure no more legitimate possessor in the world than ourselves? No, no, be easy on that score. The family is extinct. The last Count of Spada, moreover, made me his heir, bequeathing to me this symbolic breviary. He bequeathed to me all it contained. No, no, make your mind satisfied on that point. If we lay hands on this fortune, we may enjoy it without remorse. And you say this treasure amounts to 2 millions of Roman crowns, nearly 13 millions of our money. 2. Impossible, said Dantès, staggered at the enormous amount. Impossible? And why? Asked the old man. The Spada family was one of the oldest and most powerful families of the 15th century, and in those times, when other opportunities for investment were wanting, such accumulations of gold and jewels were by no means rare. There are at this day Roman families perishing of hunger, though possessed of nearly 1 million in diamonds and jewels, handed down by entail and which they cannot touch. Edmond thought he was in a dream. He wavered between incredulity and joy. I have only kept this secret so long from you, continued Faria, that I might test your character and then surprise you. Had we escaped before my attack of catalepsy, I should have conducted you to Monte Cristo. Now, he added with a sigh, it is you who will conduct me thither. Well, Dantès, you do not thank me. This treasure belongs to you, my dear friend, replied Dantès, and to you only. I have no right to it. I am no relation of yours. You are my son Dantès, exclaimed the old man. You are the child of my captivity. My profession condemns me to celibacy. God has sent you to me to console, at one and the same time, the man who could not be a father, and the prisoner who could not get free. And Faria extended the arm of which alone the use remained to him to the young man, who threw himself upon his neck and wept.